Hey guys, tonight we're weighing anchor on one of the strangest ironies to come out of the so-called Golden Age of Piracy. The fact that the outlaws being hunted across the Caribbean were, by nearly every measurable standard, eating better, drinking better, and getting paid more fairly than the king's own sailors sent to catch them. We're talking about a documented payout of as much as 800 pieces of 8 for a lost leg, set down in writing and agreed to by vote, against a Royal Navy that could take 3 years to pay a man his wages at all. We're talking fresh turtle, roasted on deck, against a pound of ship's biscuit that had been walking on its own for weeks courtesy of the weevils living inside it. We're talking about common sailors who could vote their own captain out of a job, against a navy where a single officer's bad mood could get you tied to a grating and flogged half to death. Somewhere off the coast of West Africa in February of 1722, a Welsh-born pirate named Bartholomew Roberts was killed in a running gun battle with a Royal Navy warship called the Swallow, and the strange thing, the thing that's going to sit with you tonight, is that the ship he died defending ran on fairer terms than the one that killed him. Welcome aboard. Tonight we're going to walk the decks of both worlds, the pirate sloop and the man of war, and find out exactly how upside down the law and the lawless had become. Before we get into it, go ahead and dim the lights if you can, and if you've got a fan nearby, let it hum low in the background, pretend it's wind filling out a topsail, or the creak of old timber rocking gently at anchor. You're warm right now. You've probably eaten today more than once, without having to think about it, without anyone weighing out your portion to the ounce. That comfort is exactly what we're about to test, gently, the way these stories always do, because where we're headed tonight, a full stomach and a fair wage were never guaranteed, not for the pirate, and strangely enough, even less so for the honest sailor chasing him. So get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, out past the harbour lights and into deep water. You wake to the smell of wood smoke and something frying, and for a half-second, still tangled in sleep, you forget where you are. Then the deck tilts gently under your shoulder blade, the canvas overhead snaps once in the breeze, and you remember you're aboard a pirate sloop somewhere in the Windward Passage. The year is 1720, and against every expectation you had before you signed the ship's articles, breakfast is going to be good. Not good for a sailor. Good, there's fresh fish, caught off the stern in the grey hour before dawn, and there's biscuit too, but it isn't crawling with anything, because this crew took a Bristol merchantman 11 days ago and helped themselves to her stores before her captain could hide them. You sit up on a folded sail. Hammocks were mostly a navy formality this crew skipped, since deck space was too precious to string them permanently, and you follow the smell toward the galley fire, and that's when you first notice the man everyone calls Cuffy, ladling something out of a blackened pot with the unhurried confidence of a man who has already survived the worst thing that's ever going to happen to him. Cuffy runs the cook fire, and he does it with the calm authority of someone who has decided that burnt porridge is not going to be the thing that finally breaks him. He was taken off a slave ship this crew captured near the windward coast of West Africa 8 months back, one of roughly 140 men, women and children found chained in the hold. A documented and grimly routine feature of the slave trade that pirate crews in this era, cruising the same shipping lanes as the transatlantic slave fleets, encountered constantly. Historical accounts of several Golden Age crews describe African captives being offered the choice, once a slave ship was taken, of signing the pirate articles as free men rather than being sold on or set ashore. A meaningful number, on more than one documented voyage, chose to sign. Cuffy was one of them. He gets a full share, same as anyone aboard who isn't an officer, and he made his mark on the same piece of parchment everyone else did. He hands you a plate without a word, but with a small, sharp nod that you've come to understand is his version of good morning. You'll learn more about him later. For now, you eat, and it's better than anything you had waiting tables back in Bristol before all this started. Here's the thing that would have surprised you most. Before you'd lived it yourself, pirate crews cruising the Caribbean and the West African coast during this period ate an astonishingly varied diet, almost entirely because of how they acquired their food. A merchant ship or a man of war stocked what it could carry from home port and rationed it out carefully across months at sea, because that was all there was going to be. A pirate ship, by contrast, restocked constantly, because restocking other people's cargo was the entire business model. You didn't sail for 6 months on one set of stores. You took a fresh set every few weeks from whatever vessel you'd just run down. Salted pork today might be fresh mutton next week, and turtle the week after that, because the only real limit on your diet was how many ships you managed to catch. It's the pirate version of a grocery delivery service, except the delivery fee on a bad day was cannon fire, and the tip was occasionally a hanging. By your second week aboard, you've eaten better in 14 days than some of the dock workers back in Bristol ate in a month, and you've started to understand why so many sailors taken off captured merchant ships, when offered the choice, signed the pirate articles rather than be set adrift with their old crew. It wasn't only fear of the alternative, though there was plenty of that. It was arithmetic. A man could do the sums on a full stomach faster than anyone gave him credit for. Back home, a labourer's family might scrape by on bread, small beer, and whatever pottage could be stretched furthest across a week's wages. Meat, when it appeared at all, was a Sunday event, not a daily one. Here, on a ship most respectable people would cross the street to avoid even hearing about. Meat is simply what's for dinner, more nights than not, and nobody's counting the ounces against you. Midday brings the rum ration, and this is where the ship's particular culture starts to show itself most clearly. It isn't handed out watered down and grudging, the way rumour had it the Navy did things. It's mixed into a drink called bumbo, rum, water, sugar taken from a captured cargo out of the West Indies, and a scrape of nutmeg if anyone's feeling generous. And it's poured out in roughly equal measure to every man on deck, officers included, because the articles this crew sailed under specifically forbid the captain from keeping better food or drink for himself than the rest of the company received. That isn't sentiment. That's a written rule, voted into the articles before the voyage even began, and breaking it was a punishable offence, the same as stealing from the common stock or striking a shipmate without cause. You take your cup, and Cuffy, passing by with a bucket of scraps for the ship's chickens. Yes, there are chickens. 3 of them, survivors of the same Bristol prize, and one of them is, for reasons nobody aboard can explain, named Admiral, gives you that same sharp nod. Congratulations, you've made it 2 weeks into the pirate life, and so far the food has been the least of your problems. 3 weeks out of your home port of Nassau, the sloop takes its second prize of the voyage, a Dutch trading vessel bound for Curacao, carrying salted beef, several casks of Madeira wine, and, to the crew's genuine delight, 4 live turtles taken on somewhere near the Cayman Islands. A well-documented pirate and privateer provisioning stop, where green sea turtles were once so plentiful that ships from multiple nations stopped there specifically to restock, a practice recorded by period voyagers including the English privateer and naturalist William Dampier in his own published accounts of Caribbean sailing life. Turtle meat doesn't spoil the way other fresh meat does if you keep the animal alive on deck until you're ready to eat it, which makes it, for a Caribbean crew without refrigeration of any kind, something close to a walking, breathing icebox. Tonight there's turtle stew, and Cuffy makes something out of the shell broth that a Navy purser back in Portsmouth would probably not recognise as food, but that tastes to you like the best thing you've eaten since you left home. Here's what nobody tells you about piracy going in. The fear is real, the danger is real, the noose waiting at the end of a bad decision is very real, but the actual day-to-day experience of your stomach on a successful pirate ship was frequently better than it had been in whatever desperate circumstance drove you to sea in the first place. That's not a punchline. That's one of the genuine, documented reasons this life pulled in so many recruits from merchant crews and even from the Navy itself. And it's the reason, 3 weeks in, that you've stopped flinching every time someone says the word pirate out loud, and started, quietly, to think of it as just your job. Not every week goes this well, though, and by your 6th week aboard you learn the other side of the arithmetic. A stretch of bad luck, 3 ships sighted and lost to weather or simply outrun, means the stores run down fast, faster than they would aboard a Navy ship built around slow, careful, miserly rationing. For 4 straight days, it's biscuit and water and whatever fish you can pull over the rail, and tempers run short enough that the quartermaster has to step in twice to settle disputes before fists start flying. This is the trade-off nobody advertises when they tell pirate stories. The diet was better on average, dramatically so. But it had none of the grim, steady predictability of a Navy ration. You ate like a small Time Lord after a good prize, and like a beggar in a drought, and the only insurance against the drought was catching the next ship faster than the last one. By your 3rd month aboard, you've settled into the rhythm of it. Feast, then near famine, then feast again, and you've learned to read the whole crew's mood by how full the biscuit barrels are. Cuffy, in the meantime, has become something close to the ship's unofficial physician as well as its cook, because he's the one who first noticed that the men eating the most citrus off captured Spanish and Portuguese cargo, oranges, limes, taken almost as an afterthought from a ship's stores, seemed to hold up better on long stretches at sea than the men who left the fruit to rot. Nobody aboard has the word scurvy fully worked out in any scientific sense. That understanding is still decades away, and won't be formally proven until a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind runs a controlled trial aboard Miss Salisbury in 1747. But Cuffy keeps a rough tally anyway, purely by watching who gets weak and who doesn't, and when citrus comes aboard, he makes sure it's spread around evenly rather than left to spoil in a corner of the hold. It's a small thing. It's also, unknowingly, roughly a quarter-century ahead of official Navy medical practice. It's during your 4th month that Cuffy's story becomes something more than background colour. A swell catches the ship wrong during a squall, a pot of boiling fat tips off the cook fire, and Cuffy takes a bad burn across his right hand and forearm, bad enough that 2 fingers are left permanently stiffened by the scarring once it heals. Under the ship's articles, an injury suffered in the ship's service qualified for compensation drawn from the common stock, the shared pool of plunder set aside and valued before individual shares were divided out. The crew votes that same evening, without much debate, that a galley fire counts. It isn't the far larger sum reserved under the articles for a limb lost in battle, but it's a real payment, argued over briefly, recorded by the quartermaster in the ship's rough accounts, and handed over within days, not years, not decades, not never, which is what a burned cook could expect almost anywhere else in the Atlantic world in 1720. Cuffy, hand still wrapped, takes his payment without much ceremony and goes right back to the fire the next morning. Because, as he puts it in the driest voice you've heard from a man who nearly lost the use of his hand, somebody has to keep Admiral the chicken from wandering into the surf. Word travels fast on a small ship, and within a week of Cuffy's payout, a captured Royal Navy midshipman being held for ransom aboard your vessel, a nervous 19-year-old the crew mostly ignores except at mealtimes, watches the whole business unfold from the rail with an expression you can only describe as bewildered. He's seen men maimed in his own service go unpaid and unthanked for a wound suffered in the King's name. He has never, in 3 years at sea, seen an injury settled in cash before the ship even reached port. He doesn't say much about it. He doesn't have to. You'll meet men like him again later tonight, and you'll understand exactly what's written on his face. Fresh water is the one thing no amount of captured cargo can fully solve, and it's worth pausing on, because it's the closest the pirate diet comes to matching the Navy's misery. Every ship at sea in this era, honest or not, fought the same losing battle against water going brackish and green in the cask after a few weeks, and a pirate crew was no exception, except that a pirate crew had one advantage a Navy ship rarely did: the freedom to go looking for more, whenever they wanted, without asking permission from an Admiralty desk 3,000 miles away. Your captain puts in at a stream mouth on the coast of Hispaniola specifically to refill the water casks, something a Navy captain on station could rarely justify without written orders. And when the water does turn foul before you reach the next stream, there's another captured cask of Madeira standing by to drink instead, which is more than most Navy crews could say, when their own water ran thin. It isn't a perfect system. It's simply a better one, built on the same principle as everything else aboard: more options, taken by force, beat fewer options, allotted by rule. There's a fiddler aboard too, a thin, sunburned man named Josiah, who was, by his own account, a failed tailor before he was a failed sailor, before he finally found something he was good at. Under the ship's articles, the same document that governs the food and the pay and the compensation for burns, Josiah gets Sundays to himself, a rare enough concession that the crew treats it with something close to reverence, but the rest of the week he plays, whenever asked, at meals. During the long hot afternoons on watch, sometimes late into the night when someone can't sleep. It's a small detail, and it would be easy to skip past it as colour rather than substance, but it says something real about what this crew valued enough to write down and defend, not just food and money, but the ordinary human comfort of a song after a hard day. You eat your evening meal that night at the same table as the captain, elbow to elbow, because there is no separate officer's mess on this ship, no wardroom, no rule that says rank eats better or eats apart. That single fact, captain and crew sharing one pot, would have been almost unthinkable on a king's ship of the same size, where an officer's dinner and a common sailor's dinner came from different stores entirely, cooked by different hands, served in different rooms. By the time your ship makes for a lonely stretch of coastline to careen, to haul the vessel over on its side in shallow water and scrape the hull clean of the weed and barnacles that were slowing her down, you've been aboard 4.5 months. Careening takes days, sometimes close to 2 weeks, and for that stretch the ship isn't a ship at all in any working sense. She's a beached hull. Cannons and stores hauled ashore, half the crew standing armed watch on a makeshift camp, while the other half scrapes and burns barnacle growth off the timbers with torches. It's filthy, exhausting work, and it's also, unexpectedly, one of the closest things this crew has to a holiday. There's no watch bell at 3 a.m. There's a cook fire burning on an actual beach instead of a pitching deck, and Cuffy, freed for once from bracing himself against the roll of the ship, produces something close to an actual feast out of the last of the Dutch prize's stores: turtle salted beef stretched thin with captured yams, and a barrel of Madeira broken open specifically because, as the quartermaster puts it. Morale is also a line item. You sit on the sand that first careening night with a plate balanced on your knee, and for a while nobody talks about prizes or articles or the Navy sloop that was reportedly seen cruising 2 days east of here. Josiah plays something slow. Cuffy, hand mostly healed now, sits with his bad fingers curled loosely around a cup and says, when someone finally asks him straight out whether he regrets signing, that he does not, and that he has done the arithmetic on it more than once. On the slave ship, he explains, there was no arithmetic to do, no wage, no share, no vote, no article to sign, only a hold and a destination he never chose. Here, at least, there's a piece of paper with his mark on it, and a share coming to him, and a burned hand that got paid for instead of ignored. It's not a happy story. Nobody aboard would call it that. But it is, in its narrow and complicated way, a better one than the one he started in, and he says as much without asking for anyone's sympathy, which somehow makes it land harder than if he had. None of this was a secret to the people trying to stop it, which is part of what made pirate crews so hard to root out. Colonial governors across the Caribbean and the American seaboard wrote home to London for years, complaining not just about the theft and the violence, but about how comfortable the life apparently was, compared to what honest work offered a poor sailor. Woodes Rogers, sent out in 1718 to reclaim Nassau from the pirates who turned it into a lawless free port, wrote back describing men who had grown so used to easy plunder and equal shares that ordinary wages looked, to them, like a form of punishment. It's a striking thing for a colonial governor to have to admit in an official dispatch that the criminals were, materially speaking, out-competing the legitimate economy for recruits. Wonder isn't a word you'd expect from a man sent to hang pirates, and yet the closest thing to it creeps into more than one of these surviving letters. A grudging, uneasy amazement at how well the system worked, even while insisting it had to be destroyed. You've been aboard 4.5 months now, and you've eaten fresh meat more days than not. That's not a small thing. That's the whole argument of tonight's story, and you've lived it from the inside without ever quite meaning to. The articles that governed this ship, the same parchment Cuffy signed with his mark and you signed with your name, did more than divide up plunder. They built, out of necessity and self-interest, and something that occasionally looked a great deal like fairness, a floating economy that, on its best days, outperformed the legitimate one it was stealing from. And it all traced back to that piece of paper, signed before the anchor was ever raised. That paper, the articles themselves, deserves its own story, because before there was turtle stew and bumbo and a burned cook getting paid within the week, there was a piece of parchment, signed and sworn to, that made all of it possible in the first place. The turtle stew and the burned cook's payout didn't happen by accident, and they didn't happen out of the goodness of anyone's heart. They happened because of a piece of paper, a specific physical document, drawn up and argued over and signed before a single anchor was raised, and on the morning of February the 10th, 1722, off a headland on the coast of what is now Gabon, called Cape Lopez. That piece of paper was about to be tested by cannon fire in a way no contract, however carefully worded, could survive. Bartholomew Roberts stood on the quarterdeck of his flagship, the Royal Fortune, dressed, according to the trial depositions taken from his surviving crew afterward, in a crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a gold chain slung around his neck with a diamond cross hanging from it, a red feather in his hat, and 2 pairs of pistols on silk slings across his shoulders. It is worth pausing on that detail, because it is not embellishment for its own sake. Multiple surviving depositions given independently at Cape Coast Castle a few months later describe the same outfit, which suggests it is one of the more reliably documented facts about a man whose life is otherwise wrapped in more legend than record. Roberts had, by this point, taken somewhere in the range of 400 prizes across a 3-year piratical career, making him very plausibly the most successful pirate captain of the entire Golden Age by sheer volume of ships captured. A record no other named pirate of the period comes close to matching. And in front of him, bearing down through the morning haze, was His Majesty's ship Swallow, a 4th-rate warship under Captain Challoner Ogle, sent out from London for the specific purpose of ending Roberts' career by whatever means necessary. The first broadside from the Swallow tore across the Royal Fortune's deck, and a burst of grape shot caught Roberts in the throat. He died, by every surviving account, almost instantly, still standing at the helm. His crew, following what several depositions describe as his own standing wish never to be taken alive or have his body displayed as a trophy, wrapped him in his ship's colours, weighted him down, and put him over the side into the Atlantic before the battle was even finished, a burial his enemies were furious to be denied, and one that meant the most successful pirate of his age has to this day no known grave. This is the story of the articles, the written contract, voted on and signed by every man aboard, that governed the ship Roberts commanded, and that outlived him by mere hours before the whole enterprise came apart in a single catastrophic morning. Ship's articles weren't a pirate invention out of nothing. They grew out of an older tradition among buccaneers and privateers operating in the Caribbean across the 17th century. Men who sailed under semi-legal letters of marque, dividing plunder from enemy shipping under agreed terms because there was no navy paymaster standing by to hand out wages. And because a crew scattered across a dangerous coast with no functioning government needed some agreed method for settling disputes before those disputes turned violent, potentially fatal ones. The buccaneers based out of Tortuga and later Port Royal, Jamaica, operated under a rough version of this system for decades before the Golden Age pirates who followed them ever put pen to parchment. Henry Morgan, the most famous of that earlier buccaneer generation, led fleets of privateers against Spanish colonial towns under exactly this kind of pre-agreed division of spoils, decades before Roberts was even born, and the men who sailed with him would have found the compensation clauses and share systems of the 1720s pirate articles entirely familiar, if a bit more formally written out. The maxim associated with that older buccaneer world, no prey, no pay, meaning a crew earned nothing at all unless a prize was actually taken, no matter how long or hard the voyage, survived directly into the pirate articles that came after, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Because it's the exact opposite of how a Navy sailor's wages worked. A Navy man got his low fixed pay whether his ship took 100 prizes or none at all, whether the voyage was a triumph or a disaster. A pirate got nothing at all on a bad run, and a small fortune on a good one. It was a harder, riskier bargain in the short term, and, for a great many crews across the 1710s and 1720s, a far more lucrative one over the course of a single successful year than a lifetime of honest naval service could match. By the time men like Roberts were putting their own crews under articles in the 1710s and 1720s, they were formalising and tightening a system that had already existed, in rougher form, for the better part of a century, refining it with clauses their own hard experience under bad captains had taught them to include. What made pirate articles distinct, and what makes them worth studying at all almost 300 years later, is how far they went beyond simply dividing up loot. The set of articles most often cited by historians, recorded by the author Captain Charles Johnson in his 1724 book A General History of the Pirates, claims to reproduce the actual clauses Roberts's crew sailed under. It's worth being honest about that source here, and for the rest of tonight's story, Johnson's authorship is itself disputed by scholars, and his book is known to have dramatised dialogue and invented flourishes in places, so anything traced back to it should be treated as according to the record as reported, rather than settled fact. With that caveat in place, the articles Johnson describes are still remarkable reading. Lights and candles were to be put out at 8 at night, and any man wanting to drink on past that hour had to do it on the open deck, without lights to reduce fire risk, a genuinely sensible safety rule on a wooden ship loaded with gunpowder. Gambling for money was forbidden outright. Any man who deserted the ship or his post in battle would be marooned or executed, no exceptions for rank. Boys and musicians were entitled to rest on the Sabbath, though on any other day of the week they had to play whenever asked, a clause that turns up, in slightly different form, across more than one surviving pirate crew's documented articles, and that lines up with the fiddler you met earlier tonight. The compensation clause is the one that tends to stop people cold when they hear it for the first time, and it's the one this whole story keeps circling back to. According to the articles Johnson records, a man who lost a leg or an arm in the ship's service was entitled to 800 pieces of 8 from the common stock before any other shares were divided out, a genuinely enormous sum, worth, by some modern historians' rough estimates, the equivalent of several years of an ordinary sailor's legal wages paid out in a lump sum rather than dribbled out over a working lifetime. A lost hand or a lesser limb was valued somewhat lower on a sliding scale, but the principle held across the board, your body, maimed in the ship's service, had a price, it was written down in advance, and it was paid before the captain or anyone else touched their own cut of the prize. Sit with that mechanism for a moment, because it is, in structure if not in name, a rudimentary form of disability insurance, underwritten collectively by every man aboard out of the same pool of plunder they were all risking their necks to take. Nobody aboard would have used that word. Nobody aboard had any formal concept of actuarial risk or collective underwriting. But that is functionally what they built, out of raw necessity, a full century and a half before anything resembling organised workers' compensation existed anywhere in Britain's legitimate economy, and nearly 2 centuries before it existed as a matter of law. It emerged not from any government or any employer's sense of obligation, but from a simple, shared calculation every man aboard could make for himself. Any one of them might be the next to lose a limb boarding a resisting merchantman. So it was in every man's direct self-interest to vote the fund into existence before the cannon fire started, rather than hope for charity afterward. Compare that, for a moment, to what waited for an honest sailor wounded in the King's service, and you start to understand exactly why so many merchant seamen, given the choice at gunpoint or otherwise, signed the articles rather than sail home empty-handed and whole. The pay scale itself, laid out in the same articles, is worth walking through slowly, because the gap between top and bottom is nothing like what you'd expect from a criminal enterprise supposedly run by the most ruthless man aboard. A captain typically drew somewhere between 1 and 2 full shares of a prize's value under most surviving pirate articles, and a quartermaster drew 1.5, a meaningful premium for holding the most demanding and thankless job on the ship. But nowhere near the gulf you'd find between an admiral's cabin and a common sailor's mess aboard a navy vessel. Ordinary crew members, the men doing the actual sailing and fighting, each drew a single, equal share, full stop, regardless of how long they'd served or what job they did day to day, with the single common exception of ship's boys, who typically drew a half share, being judged too young and inexperienced for full status, but still, notably, entitled to something rather than nothing. A captain aboard a successful pirate ship might, in the best years, earn something on the order of double what an ordinary crewman earned. Compare that ratio, roughly 2 to 1, top to bottom, with the difference between an English naval admiral's official compensation and an able seaman's, which by some later 18th century estimates could run well into the hundreds to 1, when prize money, allowances and patronage were all accounted for, and the pirate ship starts to look less like a den of thieves and more like the flattest pay structure operating anywhere on the Atlantic in 1720. There's a second, independently useful source that doesn't rely on Johnson at all, the articles used by a pirate captain named John Phillips in 1724, which survive not through a storyteller's book, but through actual trial records, because Phillips' articles were read aloud and entered as evidence at his crew's trial in Boston after their capture. That's about as close to a primary source as this subject gets, and it corroborates the broad shape of what Johnson describes independently: a compensation scale for lost limbs, equal division of food and drink, democratic voting on major decisions, and serious penalties for theft from the common stock or for cowardice in battle. 2 crews, sailing years apart under different captains, wrote down startlingly similar rules, which suggests this wasn't one eccentric captain's personal quirk. It was closer to an industry standard. The election of officers was the clause that most directly upended the ordinary maritime chain of command, and it deserves its own attention here. A pirate captain was not appointed by any authority above him. He was voted into the position by the crew that would serve under him, typically by simple majority, and his actual day-to-day powers were narrower than most people assume: final say in battle and while giving chase, and not a great deal more. Nearly everything else, from where the ship sailed to how a dispute between 2 crewmen got settled, went to a vote of the whole company, or fell to the quartermaster instead. And this is the part that would have been simply unthinkable on a king's ship. A pirate captain could be voted right back out again if the crew judged him a poor leader, a coward in a fight, or too harsh a disciplinarian. Charles Vane, captain of another well-documented pirate sloop operating out of the Bahamas, was deposed by his own crew in November 1718 after refusing to engage a French warship the majority of the company believed they could beat and plunder. The crew held a vote on the open deck, stripped him of command on the spot for cowardice, and put him ashore in a small sloop with a handful of men who'd voted with him, choosing a new captain, John Calico Jack Rackham, before the sun went down that same evening. It is difficult to overstate how radical that is by the standards of 18th century maritime life. Nowhere else on the ocean, under any flag, could a common sailor vote his commanding officer out of a job in an afternoon over a single tactical disagreement, and simply carry on sailing under someone new the very same day. Not every clause in the articles reads as progressive by any modern measure, and it's worth being honest about that too, rather than polishing the record into something cleaner than it was. Johnson's version of Roberts' articles includes a clause forbidding any woman or boy from being brought aboard, with the punishment for smuggling a disguised woman onto the ship set, on paper at death, a rule apparently aimed at preventing the jealousy and violence the crew feared such a situation would cause in close quarters, rather than any broader statement of principle. It's a stark reminder that this was a fairer system by the narrow standards of who was already aboard and already counted as a full member of the crew, not a fair system by any modern measure of who got a seat at the table in the first place. And it makes the two most famous exceptions to that rule, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, both of whom sailed disguised as men aboard Calico Jack Rackham's crew and were tried alongside the men when captured in 1720. All the more striking a piece of the era's history, women who broke a written rule meant to keep them out entirely, and who fought, by multiple witness accounts given at their own trial, harder than most of the men around them did when the ship was finally taken. Enforcement of the articles fell mostly to the quartermaster, a position we'll come back to properly later, but it's worth noting here that punishment for breaking them was swift, communal, and, by the standards of naval discipline in this era, often surprisingly restrained. A man caught stealing from the common stock or from a shipmate might be marooned on an empty stretch of coastline. Left with a pistol, a small amount of shot and powder, and a single bottle of water, which was a genuinely severe punishment and sometimes, in practice, a slow death sentence by starvation, thirst, or exposure on some forgotten quay far from any shipping lane, but it was, notably, not flogging and not the arbitrary, repeated. Officers' discretion violence that governed discipline on almost every navy and merchant vessel of the era. Pirate crews, having generally experienced navy or merchant ship discipline themselves before turning to piracy, many of them, in fact having turned to piracy specifically because of it, seem to have deliberately avoided replicating the whip as a routine tool of daily management. Disputes between two crewmen were, according to multiple surviving accounts, sometimes settled by a formal duel ashore rather than left to fester or handled by an officer's unilateral punishment, with the quartermaster or another crew member standing by to stop the fight the moment first blood was drawn, treating honour as satisfied rather than letting the disagreement escalate to a killing. It's the pirate version of workplace policy, written by people who've all had a truly terrible boss at some point in their working lives, and who are determined, on this ship at least, not to become one themselves. None of it saved Roberts on the morning the Swallow found him. The articles could distribute a fair share of plunder, compensate a burned hand or a shattered leg, and even depose an unpopular captain, but they had no answer for Grapeshot. When the battle ended, 272 men were taken prisoner off the Royal Fortune and her consort ships. What followed was one of the largest pirate trials of the entire era, held at Cape Coast Castle on the West African coast. The April 52 men were convicted and hanged, a number that remains. To this day, one of the largest mass executions of pirates on record, while dozens of others, men who could convincingly demonstrate they'd been forced aboard against their will, a defence the court took seriously and sometimes accepted, were acquitted or sentenced to indentured servitude instead of the noose. The articles Roberts' crew had lived and eaten and been paid under didn't save any of them from the Swallow's guns. But the trial record they left behind, ironically, is one of the reasons historians today have such unusually detailed evidence for how a pirate ship actually ran. Depositions taken from dozens of separate men, questioned individually and without the chance to coordinate their stories beforehand, describe the same voting procedures, the same rough shares, the same compensation practices, independent testimony converging on the same picture, which is about as close to verified as anything from this period gets. The court at Cape Coast Castle wasn't trying to preserve a record of pirate labour practices for future historians, of course. It was trying to hang as many of these men as the evidence would support. It simply happened to do both at once. That evidence hasn't gone unnoticed by modern scholars. Either historians studying the economics and social structure of Golden Age piracy have pointed to documents like Roberts' and Phillips' articles as some of the earliest surviving examples of workers collectively writing down and voting on the terms of their own labour. A set of practices that, in outline if not in violent method, anticipates ideas about worker representation, injury compensation, and democratic workplace governance that wouldn't become common in legitimate industries for another century or more. It's a strange legacy for a document that also authorised marooning as a punishment, and it's exactly the kind of contradiction this whole story keeps circling, a genuinely fairer system. built by men the world had already given up on, running just a few decks away from a navy that couldn't manage the same fairness with the full backing of the crown. It's a strange thing to sit with, a document written by outlaws, tested against a king's warship, and found wanting only in the one area no contract could ever cover, and yet more thoroughly documented, in some respects, than the pay arrangements of the very navy that hunted its authors down. Which brings us, fairly enough, to that navy, because the contrast only means something once you've actually seen the other side of it up close. You wake before dawn to the shrill scream of a boatswain's whistle and the sound of 200 men swearing quietly in the dark, and for a moment, still half asleep, your body doesn't understand why it hurts. Then you remember. You slept 16 inches from the next hammock, packed in so tight along the gun deck that when the ship rolls, you all roll together, and your shoulder has been jammed against a timber knee half the night, a bruise you've stopped bothering to check anymore, because there's always a fresh one waiting to replace it. The air down here smells like bilge water, tar, wet rope, and roughly 200 unwashed bodies who haven't had a proper bath in longer than any of them care to admit, and it doesn't get better as you climb up toward the light. You're aboard His Majesty's ship Centurion, somewhere off the Iberian coast, in the year 1740, and you didn't choose to be here. Nobody down on this deck chose to be here. That's not a figure of speech. It's the actual, legal, documented starting point for a very large share of the Royal Navy's manpower during this entire period, and it's where your day and this chapter genuinely begins. You were taken by the press gang 11 weeks ago, dragged out of a Portsmouth tavern by 6 men with clubs, and a warrant that gave them the legal authority to do exactly what they did. Under a system of impressment that had been standard, if bitterly resented, English maritime practice for well over a century by this point, formalised repeatedly by Parliament through a series of Vice-Admiralty statutes that gave naval officers broad power to seize eligible men, meaning, in practice, almost any able-bodied man found near a port with no obvious protection from a powerful patron, and put them aboard a king's ship whether they liked it or not. You had a wife. You had a job mending nets. None of that mattered to the press gang, and none of it matters now. You signed nothing. You agreed to nothing. You are, by any honest modern description of the word, a conscript, and you will remain one for as long as the Navy decides your service is needed, which in wartime could mean years without so much as a letter home. Technically, the law recognised certain protections. Apprentices, for instance, were meant to be exempt, and so were men already serving aboard outward-bound merchant vessels engaged in specific trades. But a press gang working a crowded dockside tavern late at night, under quota pressure from a fleet that never has quite enough hands, was not always inclined to check paperwork closely before the club came down. Beside you in the mess this morning is a boy named Davy Cobb, 14 years old, taken off the same Portsmouth dock the same night you were, though in his case the press gang barely had to argue. A king's officer can legally take a boy that young if there's no father or master to formally object on the spot, and Davy's father had died at sea 2 years prior, which made him, in the ugly language of the recruiting officers available, his mother. He tells you quietly one evening early in the voyage, runs a small laundry business out of their rented rooms near the dockyard, and he worries more about how she'll manage without his help carrying and delivering than he does, at least out loud, about his own safety aboard a ship of war. He's been assigned as a powder monkey, which means that in battle his entire job will be running gunpowder cartridges from the magazine below the waterline up to the guns on deck, over and over, as fast as his legs will carry him. In a space where a single stray spark could kill everyone aboard in an instant. He hasn't seen a fight yet. He talks about it, when the older men aren't around to hear, with a kind of nervous bravado that makes your chest ache a little. Because you remember being that certain of your own invincibility once, before you understood what you'd actually signed up for, or rather, what had been decided for you. Breakfast is burgoo, a thick oatmeal porridge, alongside a ration of ship's biscuit that has been aboard for going on 4 months now and shows it. You've learned, like everyone else on this deck, to tap your biscuit firmly against the mess table before you bite into it, because the vibration knocks loose the weevils that have made a home inside small dark beetles and their larvae. A near universal feature of long-stored ship's biscuit in this era, well enough documented in surviving sailors' letters and Navy victualling complaints that it barely counts as gossip anymore. Some of the older hands call the weevils bargemen, on the grounds that they're technically fellow travellers on the voyage and might as well be given a nickname. Davy, still new enough to find this more disgusting than funny, picks his out one by one before eating, which takes him twice as long as everyone else and earns him no sympathy whatsoever from the men who've simply learned to eat around them, or, more often, not to look too closely. Here's the detail that turns the biscuit ration from merely disgusting into something closer to fraud. The pound of biscuit you're issued is not, in fact, a full 16-ounce pound. Royal Navy pursers. The officers responsible for managing and distributing a ship's provisions, operated for generations under a customary allowance sometimes called the purser's pound, in which 14 ounces of actual food counted, by long-standing and officially tolerated practice, as a full pound for accounting purposes. The missing 2 ounces on every single pound issued to every single man aboard were the pursers to keep, sell or pocket, a built-in and semi-legal skimming operation baked directly into the Navy's own supply system, tolerated for so long that by the time you're eating this morning's biscuit, most sailors don't even think to be angry about it anymore. It's simply how the arithmetic of naval life works. You are shorted, by design, on nearly everything that passes through a purser's hands, and the shortfall is not a scandal. It's policy. You see your first flogging in your second week aboard, and it's the kind of thing that reorganises, permanently, how you understand the ship you're now trapped on. A topman named Fletcher is caught sleeping on watch, a serious offence on any vessel but a capital one, technically, under the Articles of War that govern discipline throughout the entire Royal Navy, 36 articles, read aloud to the assembled crew at the start of every commission, several of which specify death as the punishment for infractions that would draw a fine or a stern word almost anywhere else in 18th century working life. Fletcher isn't hanged. He's given 24 lashes instead, tied by the wrists to an upright grating on the open deck, while the entire crew is mustered to watch, because witnessing punishment is itself considered part of its deterrent value. The boatswain's mate does the work with a catto 9 tails, 9 knotted cords bound to a single handle, kept, by long tradition, in a red baize bag when not in use, which is where the old sailor's phrase "the cat's out of the bag" is widely believed to originate. You watch Fletcher's back open up in stripes that will scar for the rest of his life, and you watch the surgeon step forward afterward, not with any particular sympathy, but simply to confirm the man is fit to be cut down. Nobody votes on whether this punishment fits the offence. Nobody votes on whether it happens at all. The captain has ordered it, the Articles of War permit it, and that is the entire extent of the process. Davy Cobb, standing beside you in the muster, doesn't say anything for the rest of that day, and you don't ask him to. By your 3rd month aboard, you've come to understand the ship's rationing system as a kind of grim, well-oiled machine, one built for predictability rather than abundance. Meat days come twice a week, when you might get salt beef so heavily preserved and so many months old that sailors across the fleet have been known, only half joking, to carve buttons, dice, or small trinkets out of the tougher cuts rather than eat them, a detail recorded often enough in period accounts and later naval histories to have become something close to a running joke among historians of the Georgian Navy. The rest of the week runs on smaller portions of cheese so hard it's occasionally used to patch a leaking gun carriage, dried peas, and more biscuit. It's calorically sufficient, mostly when supplies are running properly. It is never, under any circumstance, varied, surprising, or something you look forward to. You eat because the body demands it, not because any part of you is hungry for what's actually on the plate. Then there's the grog, and here at least, in 1740, something new is happening. Admiral Edward Vernon, commanding this very fleet, has just this year ordered that the sailors' daily rum ration be diluted with water before serving, specifically to cut down on drunkenness and the discipline problems it caused. a genuine, documented reform, though one imposed from above rather than voted on by the men it affected, which is exactly the distinction that separates this ship from the one you visited earlier tonight. Vernon himself is known throughout the fleet by the nickname Old Grog, after the grogram cloak he's fond of wearing on deck, and the watered rum ration takes his nickname with it into naval tradition, becoming simply grog for the next 2 centuries of British naval service. You get your ration. It's fair in the narrow sense that everyone gets the same measured amount, but it was decided for you, announced to you, and you had no vote in the matter whatsoever, the same as everything else aboard this ship. Disease turns out to be a far greater danger aboard this ship than any enemy action, and by your 4th month at sea you understand why sailors sometimes call scurvy the true admiral of the fleet. Men's gums begin to soften and bleed. Old wounds and long-healed scars reopen on their own for no visible reason. Teeth loosen in their sockets, and joints ache with a deep, persistent pain that no amount of rest seems to ease. Nobody aboard this ship, in 1740, understands the actual cause. That understanding is still 7 years away, waiting on a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind, who will run one of history's first controlled clinical trials aboard Miss Salisbury in 1747, dividing 12 scorbutic sailors into pairs and testing different remedies. Discovering that citrus fruit works dramatically better than cider, vinegar or seawater, though it will then take the official navy the better part of another half-century to fully adopt citrus rationing as standard practice across the fleet. For now, in your own present, the ship's surgeon treats scurvy with a rotating and largely ineffective mix of remedies, and the real treatment, when it happens at all, is simply making landfall somewhere fresh food can be had, which on a long blockade or convoy escort duty might not happen for months at a stretch. You've heard, by now, enough about how pirate crews handled this same problem almost by accident, simply by restocking constantly from captured cargo, that the comparison sits with you uncomfortably every time you watch another man's gums start to bleed. By your 5th month aboard, you've watched the ship's surgeon deal with the first serious injury of the voyage, a topman who fell nearly 30 feet from the mizzen rigging during a squall and shattered his lower leg on the deck. And you've learnt exactly how little the Navy's formal machinery does for a man in that position compared to what you'd later hear pirate crews arrange for themselves. There is no article, no vote, no fixed sum owed to him from a common stock. There is the ship's surgeon, doing his best with a saw and a bottle of rum for anaesthesia, and there is, afterward, a long, uncertain road through naval bureaucracy, a formal application, eventually, for a pension through the chest at Chatham, a genuine charitable fund established as far back as 1590 specifically to support wounded and disabled sailors, into which every serving man's own wages were in fact already being docked a small amount each month, whether he was ever injured or not. It's real. It exists. It has helped real men. It has also, across generations, become notorious for slow, bureaucratic processing, insufficient funding relative to the number of legitimate claims, and payouts that a wounded man might wait months or years to see, assuming his paperwork survives the journey through multiple offices without being lost. By your 8th month, word reaches your mess deck, the way news always does, second-hand, from a fellow topman who heard it from a boatswain's mate who'd spoken with a captured merchant sailor recently released from a pirate crew's custody in the West Indies, that pirates operating out of Nassau are said to eat fresh turtle most weeks and get paid outright, in coin, for a lost limb, without waiting on any chest or any pension board. Nobody aboard quite believes it at first. It sounds like exactly the kind of exaggerated tavern tale that spreads among bored sailors on a long voyage. But the story keeps circulating, told and retold with small variations, the way true rumours tend to persist longer than invented ones. And more than one man on your deck goes quiet for a moment when he hears it, doing, you suspect, exactly the arithmetic you did back on your first pirate encounter, except this time the sum comes out very differently, because you are not free to act on it. You are property of the Crown for the duration of this commission, whatever the arithmetic says. By your 7th month, the ship finally makes port at Gibraltar to take on fresh water and stores, and you learn one more small bitter fact about naval life. You are not, in most circumstances, allowed off the ship. Officers may go ashore. Common sailors, more often than not, stay aboard, watched, because the Navy's own commanders know perfectly well how many of their pressed men would simply walk away and never come back given half a chance at solid ground and an unguarded moment. It is, in its way, an admission built directly into standard practice. The service trusts its own men so little that it treats a friendly port, in friendly territory, as a security risk requiring active management. You watch the shore from the rail, taverns, a market, ordinary civilian life carrying on a few hundred yards away, close enough to smell the bread baking, and you are not permitted to set foot on it. Contrast that, for a moment, against the picture you carried with you from the very start of tonight's story. A pirate crew beached for 2 weeks of careening, cook fires burning on open sand, a fiddler playing late into the night, nobody standing guard over anyone else, because nobody aboard needs guarding against their own desire to stay. One crew earned its rest by choice, and shared it as a matter of course. The other earns its port call, and is denied the ground beneath it. Out of a fear the Navy itself built into the system through the very manner it recruited half its men in the first place. What happens below decks after dark, when the officers are asleep and the men left on watch start swapping stories about desertion, is a different matter, but that's not yet. And not tonight's subject either. For now, there's a watch to stand, and Davy Cobb needs someone to show him how to properly coil a line before the boatswain notices he's doing it wrong again. Davy Cobb's turn comes during a minor engagement with a French privateer off Cape Finisterre in your 10th month aboard, and it happens exactly the way you'd feared it might since the day you watched him practicing his run to the magazine with obvious, nervous pride. A splinter of oak, blown loose from the ship's own rail by an incoming shot. Splinters, not musket balls, are the leading cause of death and maiming aboard wooden warships in this era, a grim and well-documented fact of naval combat that rarely makes it into the more romantic retellings, catches him across the thigh as he's running his third cartridge up from below. He survives. He loses the leg below the knee, taken off by the same surgeon who watched Fletcher's flogging without comment. Working this time with a saw, a leather strap between the boy's teeth, and whatever speed he can manage before shock takes hold. There is no vote on Davy's behalf. There is no fund waiting to pay him a fixed sum the same day. There is, eventually, months later, after the ship finally makes port and the paperwork finally works its way through channels. A small disability pension application filed on his behalf through the chest at Chatham, the same fund every man aboard has been quietly paying into all along, whether he ever expected to need it or not, and a long wait to hear whether it will be approved, for how much, and when the money might actually arrive. 14 years old, one leg, and a piece of paper working its way through an office in Chatham at its own unhurried pace. You think more than once in the weeks that follow about a burned cook's hand, paid for within days by men the whole world calls criminals. By the time your first year aboard is finally up, assuming the ship isn't kept at sea past her expected commission, which happens more often than the Admiralty likes to admit, you still haven't been paid a single shilling. Not one. Wages accrue on paper, tracked in the ship's books, but they are not actually dispersed until the ship is paid off at the end of her commission. Sometimes years after the voyage that earned them, a system built in large part around the Crown's own chronic difficulty keeping enough hard currency on hand to pay its fleet promptly during a period of near-constant warfare with France and Spain. You have technically earned money this entire time, you have seen almost none of it, and the piece of paper that's supposed to eventually make that right, the pay ticket, deserves a story of its own, because it turns out to be almost as strange and almost as troubled as the ship you're currently serving on. Outside the Navy Pay Office on Tower Hill in London, on a grey morning in the 1740s, a sailor named, for the purposes of tonight's story, since no single documented individual's full story survives in enough detail to carry a chapter alone, though the situation itself is thoroughly documented across hundreds of surviving petitions and complaints. Thomas Yeoman stands in a line that has not moved in over an hour, holding a folded piece of paper that represents, on its face, everything he has owed for 4 years of naval service. He has been waiting, at this point, since well before dawn, and the line stretches back around the corner of the building, dozens of men deep, most of them looking as tired and threadbare as he does. Around him, working the same line with the practiced patience of men who do this every single day, are a handful of well-dressed men who are not sailors at all, but professional ticket brokers, quietly offering ready cash, right now today, in exchange for a discounted claim on whatever the pay office might eventually be persuaded to disperse. One of them approaches Yeoman directly and offers him, on the spot, roughly half the ticket's stated face value in coin he can spend within the hour, rather than a full payment he might wait months more to actually receive. Yeoman hesitates. He has a family in Deptford who have not seen a shilling from him since he shipped out. He takes the broker's offer. This is the story of the ticket, the single piece of paper that stood between 4 years of a sailor's labour and the money he'd actually earned for it, and the strange half-legal shadow economy that grew up specifically to exploit the gap between the two. To understand why that gap existed at all, you have to go back to the basic financial architecture of the Georgian Royal Navy, which was, for most of the 17th and 18th centuries, chronically and almost comically underfunded relative to the size of the fleet it was expected to maintain. England, and then Britain, fought an almost unbroken sequence of expensive wars against France. Spain and the Dutch Republic across this entire period, and the Crown's treasury, drawing on a tax and borrowing system that was primitive by modern standards, simply could not keep pace with what a fleet the size of the Royal Navy actually cost to run man and pay on any predictable schedule. Rather than pay sailors their wages in regular, reliable instalments the way a modern employer would, the Navy instead issued pay tickets, formal numbered paper certificates recording exactly how much a given man was owed, redeemable, in theory, at the Navy pay office once the ship had been formally paid off at the end of her commission. In practice, once the ship had been paid off could mean months or years after the actual service that earned the money, and the pay office itself, chronically backlogged and chronically short of ready cash, might then take additional months to actually process and disperse a given man's claim once he finally arrived in person to collect it, which itself required either being in London or travelling there at his own expense and on his own time, an especially cruel requirement for a man who had, by definition, just spent years at sea with no income at all. Samuel Pepys, better remembered today for his diary than for his day job, spent much of his career as Clerk of the Acts to the Navy Board in the 1660s, 70s and 80s trying, with real and documented effort, to reform exactly this system, tightening the Navy's accounting, pushing for more regular disbursement, and fighting, with mixed and often frustrating results, against the institutional corruption and simple lack of funds that made prompt payments so difficult to achieve in practice. Pepys's own diary records his private frustration at the scale of the problem more than once, describing sailors reduced to begging in the streets of London and Portsmouth for want of pay owed to them, a sight he found genuinely troubling even as he struggled, from his own desk, to do much about it in any immediate way. Pepys succeeded in professionalising significant parts of the Navy's administration over the course of his career, and naval historians generally credit him with real, lasting improvements to how the fleet was organised and supplied. What he could not fully solve, because the underlying problem was structural rather than administrative, was the Crown's basic inability to keep the Navy fully and promptly funded during a period of nearly continuous warfare. The ticket system he inherited was still, in its essential shape, the ticket system sailors were still dealing with 60 and 80 years after his death. The brokers waiting outside the pay office, men sometimes called tallymen or simply ticket buyers in period accounts and satirical prints of the era, which depicted them with a mixture of contempt and grudging fascination, occupied an ethically murky but entirely legal niche in this broken system. A sailor with an unpaid ticket had, in theory, every right to simply wait in line until the pay office processed his full claim. In practice, a great many sailors couldn't afford to wait. They had families going hungry in port towns up and down the coast. They had debts run up on the strength of expected pay, often to the very same tavern keepers and boarding house landlords who'd been feeding and housing them while they waited for their ship to be paid off. A broker offering 50 or 60% of a ticket's face value in immediate cash and surviving complaints to Parliament suggest the discount could run considerably steeper than that in periods of especially severe backlog, sometimes reported as low as a third of a ticket's stated value, was, however exploitative, often the only realistic option a desperate man actually had. The Navy itself was aware this shadow market existed, complained about it periodically in official correspondence, and did remarkably little to actually shut it down, in part because reforming it seriously would have meant confronting the Crown's own chronic inability to pay its sailors on time in the first place, which was the actual root of the problem the brokers were merely profiting from, rather than causing. Running in parallel to the pay ticket system, and touched on already through the purser's short-changed pound of biscuit, was the broader problem of provisioning corruption, which the Navy Board tried, with only partial success across generations of reform efforts, to keep in check. Pursers were required, by regulation, to purchase their position, to post a bond and effectively buy the office, on the understanding that the customary allowances built into the job, the purser's pound chief among them, would let them recoup that investment and turn a reasonable profit over the course of a commission. It was, in other words, a system that built financial incentive to shortchange the crew directly into the job description of the man responsible for feeding them, sanctioned from above rather than corrected by it. Reform-minded officers periodically complained about the practice in writing. Wholesale abolition of the purser's pound and related customary allowances would not actually happen until well into the following century, long after the events of tonight's story. There was, to be fair to the system, a genuine attempt at a safety net running alongside all of this dysfunction, the chest at Chatham, mentioned briefly already, which deserves a slightly closer look here as an institution in its own right. Established in 1590, reportedly at the initiative of the naval commanders Sir John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake, in the aftermath of the campaign against the Spanish Armada, the chest was funded by compulsory deductions taken directly from every serving sailor's own wages, a genuinely early and, on paper, forward-thinking form of mandatory collective insurance against injury, administered by trustees and intended specifically to provide pensions for men disabled in the King's service. It is, in its underlying logic, not so different from the compensation clause built into a pirate crew's articles, a shared fund, contributed to by everyone, drawn on by the unlucky. The crucial difference was administration and speed. The pirate fund was assessed and paid out by a vote taken the same evening an injury occurred, by men who knew the injured party personally and had every reason to want the system to work smoothly, since any one of them might need it next. The chest at Chatham, by contrast, was administered by a rotating board of trustees often based far from the fleet, was chronically plagued across its long history by allegations of mismanagement and outright embezzlement, and required a wounded sailor to formally petition, wait, and often wait again, sometimes for years, before seeing a shilling of the money he had, quite literally, already paid into the fund himself out of his own withheld wages. There was, in fairness to the Royal Navy, a system of prize money too, a share of the value of any enemy ship a King's vessel captured, distributed among the crew who took her, in a distant echo of exactly the incentive pirates were exploiting outright. On paper, this should have narrowed the gap between the two worlds considerably. In practice, Navy prize money ran through an entirely different kind of bottleneck than a pirate crew's plunder ever did. A captured vessel first had to be sailed or towed to a friendly port, then formally condemned as a legitimate prize by an Admiralty prize court, a legal process that could take months by itself, even when uncontested, and considerably longer if the ship's owners or a rival claimant chose to dispute the seizure. Only after condemnation was the prize actually sold at auction, and only after the sale was the resulting money divided, by a formula that, unlike a pirate crew's roughly 2-to-1 ratio between captain and common sailor, was steeply weighted toward officers above them, the admiral commanding the station, who might draw a substantial cut of every prize taken by any ship under his command without having personally fired a single shot. An ordinary seaman's share of a rich prize, once the court's fees, the admiral's portion, and the officers' larger shares had all been deducted, could work out to a genuinely small sum by the time it eventually arrived. Sometimes years after the capture itself, subject to exactly the same kind of ticket and broker shadow market already described, since prize money too was frequently issued as a paper claim rather than actual coin in hand. It's worth asking, at this point, what a system this slow and this exploitative actually cost the Navy in return, beyond the obvious human misery, and the answer is desertion, chronic, persistent, and from the Admiralty's own perspective, a genuine operational headache across the entire period. Desertion carried severe legal penalties, up to and including death under the Articles of War, and yet ships' muster books from this era routinely show men vanishing at the first opportunity a friendly port offered, willing to risk the noose rather than continue serving under a system that owed them years of unpaid wages with no reliable date of settlement in sight. Naval officers complained about this constantly in their own correspondence, sometimes with genuine bewilderment at why men would risk hanging to escape a service that was, they insisted, an honourable one. The sailors who actually deserted rarely left behind an explanation quite so philosophical. They simply left, and a certain number of them, having already crossed one legal line by deserting, found the further leap into outright piracy a smaller step than it might otherwise have seemed, trading one set of risks for another, but this time at least, for a system that promised to pay them promptly for whatever came next. The Navy's own chronic failure to pay its men on time was not the only cause of the Golden Age of Piracy's steady recruitment from among honest sailors and even from within the Navy's own ranks. But naval historians examining the period have consistently identified it as one of the more significant and self-inflicted ones, a problem the Crown largely understood, complained about internally for decades, and declined, for lack of funds and lack of political will, to seriously fix. A wounded topman petitioning the chest in this era might find his claim delayed by missing paperwork from a ship's surgeon who had since been posted elsewhere, by a backlog of hundreds of similar petitions ahead of his own, or simply by the ordinary friction of an 18th century bureaucracy trying to verify a claim from a man who could not easily travel to argue his case in person. Some petitioners waited so long that the trustees processing their claims changed hands entirely between the date of application and the date of resolution, forcing a wounded man to essentially restate his case to an entirely new set of administrators unfamiliar with anything that had already been established. Petitions and complaints preserved in Admiralty records document men waiting years for a resolution, some dying before their claims were ever settled, their families left to pursue the matter, if they had the means and the literacy to do so, on the injured man's behalf. It is a genuinely well-intentioned system, older than any pirate ship's articles by well over a century, undone not by bad intentions, but by chronic underfunding, weak oversight, and the sheer scale of a fleet that grew, across the 18th century, far faster than the institutions meant to support its wounded ever managed to keep pace with. The human cost of all this delay didn't stay confined to the men actually at sea. Surviving petitions submitted to the Admiralty and to Parliament across the 18th century include a steady, sobering stream of letters from sailors' wives, women left ashore for years at a time with no income, no clear date of return for their husbands, and no legal standing to collect a ticket that had been issued in someone else's name. Some petitioned directly for relief from parish poor funds while they waited. Others, more desperate, wrote pleading letters to the Navy Board itself, asking simply for information about whether their husbands were even still alive, since a ship on a distant station might go a year or more without any word reaching home at all. Thomas Yeoman's wife in Deptford is, in this composite account, one of thousands of women living exactly that reality at any given moment across the 18th century, not a footnote to the pay-ticket story, but arguably its most direct casualty, since she bore the immediate, daily cost of a delay her husband had no power whatsoever to shorten. It is worth remembering, when a pirate crew's swift and equal division of plunder starts to sound almost too good to be believed, that the honest alternative wasn't merely inconvenient. It could mean real hunger, in a real household, for years running, while a piece of government paper slowly worked its way through an office in London. Some reform did eventually come, though slowly and only partially, and it's worth giving it fair credit here rather than painting the whole system as static for 200 years running. Real change was possible, when enough pressure built behind it, even within an institution as slow-moving and habitually underfunded as the 18th century Navy Board. In 1758, Parliament passed an act allowing serving sailors to formally allot a portion of their wages to be paid directly to a wife or family member back home, while the man himself remained at sea, rather than forcing every household to wait, as Thomas Yeoman's did, for the full sum to arrive in a single lump payment whenever the ship was finally paid off. It was a genuine improvement, born directly out of decades of exactly the kind of petitions and complaints described above, and it did measurably ease the worst of the hardship for families who could take advantage of it. It did not, however, touch the underlying ticket system itself, the purser's pound, or the chest's slow and uneven administration, all of which continued largely unchanged for decades more. Reform in the Georgian Navy tended to arrive this way, piecemeal, grudging, applied to the symptom closest at hand rather than the structural cause underneath it. Decades after the men actually suffering under the old system had already started deserting, or turning pirate, or simply doing without. Set the two systems side by side, and the comparison becomes almost uncomfortably stark. A pirate crew operating entirely outside the law, with no government backing, no formal courts, and no institutional continuity beyond whichever men happened to be aboard on a given voyage, managed to build and reliably administer an injury compensation fund that paid out within days. Run by men with no legal training and no formal accounting education beyond whatever arithmetic the job itself demanded of them, a crown with the full machinery of a professional bureaucracy, a century and a half of institutional experience, and the legal authority to compel every sailor's contribution in advance, managed a system so slow and so frequently mismanaged that sailors circulated stories about it the same way you'd circulate a cautionary tale. A warning to expect delay and disappointment rather than prompt relief. This is the story of the ticket, and the chest, and the purser's dishonest pound. 3 different pieces of paper, 3 different promises, all of them technically real, all of them chronically, structurally slow to deliver on what they promised, standing in sharp and uncomfortable contrast to a system built by men the Crown was actively trying to hang. It would take a genuine crisis, decades later, to finally force the Crown's hand on any of this in a serious way. But that crisis hadn't happened yet. Not in the 1720s, not in the 1740s, not for another half-century after Bartholomew Roberts went into the Atlantic off Cape Lopez. For now, the gap between what a pirate crew built voluntarily and what the Royal Navy managed under full legal authority simply continued, year after year, largely unaddressed, while men like Thomas Yeoman sold their honestly earned tickets at a steep discount just to put bread on the table before the week was out. The cry comes down from the masthead just after 8 bells in the forenoon watch. Sail ho! 2 points off the starboard bow. And before the words have even finished echoing across the deck, you feel the whole ship change underneath you, the way a held breath changes a room. You're back aboard the pirate sloop now, a few months further into the voyage than where you left off, and the sound of that cry does something to your stomach that no amount of practice has ever quite dulled. Somewhere out past the haze, low on the water, is a sail that might mean nothing at all, or might mean the difference between a lean month and a rich one. The chase itself is almost anticlimactic compared to the tension leading up to it. Your sloop is built for speed, shallow drafted, lightly rigged, designed from the keel up to outrun anything large enough to fight her and outsail anything small enough to catch. and within 2 hours you've closed the gap on what turns out to be a Bristol-registered merchantman running low and heavy in the water. Clearly loaded with cargo, her sails full and her crew, judging by how slowly they respond to your approach, apparently in no great hurry to believe what's bearing down on them until it's already far too late to matter. Your captain doesn't raise the black flag immediately. He runs up false colours first, a common ruse among pirate vessels of this period. Flying the flag of whatever nation seems likeliest to get the merchant ship to hold her course rather than run, in this case an English ensign, since a fellow Englishman raises less alarm at a distance than a known pirate silhouette would. Only once you're within cannon range does the false flag come down and the real one go up. Black, with a white device stitched onto it that varies from ship to ship and captain to captain, but that carries by 1720 an unmistakable and universally understood meaning up and down these shipping lanes. It's worth pausing on the flag itself for a moment, because the colour mattered a great deal more than popular imagination generally credits it for. A black flag, across most of the Golden Age's documented conventions, signalled that a target ship could expect quarter, mercy, in plain terms, if she struck her colours and surrendered without a fight. A red flag, by contrast, a considerably rarer sight, and one that struck genuine terror into any crew that saw it run up a mast, signalled the opposite. No quarter would be given regardless of surrender, a promise of violence rather than an offer of mercy, typically reserved for a target that had already resisted, or for pirate captains whose reputations ran especially vicious. The distinction was, in effect, a piece of psychological infrastructure built directly into the pirate business model, a visual contract, understood across national lines and language barriers alike, that rewarded quick, bloodless surrender and punished stubborn resistance. And that let a pirate crew take prize after prize with minimal violence, precisely because the alternative had been made so vividly, visibly clear in advance. This is the story of the flag as much as the ship flying it, a single square of cloth doing more to keep both sides alive than any amount of shouted negotiation across open water ever could have managed on its own. Here's the detail that surprises most people the first time they hear it. The merchantman surrenders almost immediately, without a shot fired in anger from either side. This wasn't unusual. It was in fact the outcome pirate crews actively worked to encourage, because a fight cost them time, powder, and potentially crew members they couldn't easily replace, while a quick surrender cost them nothing and generally meant the captured crew would be treated reasonably well, sometimes even recruited rather than harmed. Pirate captains understood, and some period accounts describe them cultivating a kind of grim marketing logic around this, a reputation for brutal treatment of resisting crews. Paired with a reputation for comparatively mild treatment of those who surrendered quickly, gave every subsequent merchant captain a strong incentive to strike his colours the moment a pirate flag went up, rather than risk a fight he was unlikely to win anyway. Fear, deployed carefully, saved everyone time, including, in a strange way, the merchant crew's own lives. Among the captured men standing on the merchantman's deck, hands raised, is a broad-shouldered carpenter named Robert Tunstall, and his situation is about to become considerably more complicated than most of his shipmates, who mostly stand quietly waiting to learn whether they'll be released, recruited, or simply relieved of anything valuable and sent on their way none the worse for thee. Encounter. A ship's carpenter is a skilled tradesman, difficult to replace, and pirate crews, chronically short of exactly this kind of specialised labour, since skilled men had far less reason to turn pirate voluntarily than desperate common sailors did. Routinely singled out carpenters, surgeons, navigators and musicians from a captured crew and gave them a choice that wasn't entirely a choice at all. Sign the articles and join, or be marooned, or in rare and more brutal cases, be killed outright for refusing a skill the pirates genuinely needed. Tunstall stands on the deck doing the same fast, frightened arithmetic every forced man in this period had to do, weighing an uncertain future as a wanted criminal against a near certain unpleasant one as a man set ashore with nothing on some stretch of unfamiliar coast. Your own quartermaster makes the offer plainly, without much theatre to it, sign or don't. And if you don't, We'll put you off at the next landfall with water and a blanket, and no hard feelings either way. It's a strange kind of courtesy wrapped around a genuine act of coercion, and Tunstall seems to sense both halves of it at once. He signs. By the time the prize's hold is fully opened and inventoried, the true value of the catch starts to become clear. And this is where the quartermaster's real work begins. Every piece of cargo, bolts of cloth, casks of wine, crates of tools, a strong box of coin found in the captain's cabin, gets appraised, tallied and recorded before a single item changes hands informally. Because the entire crew has a direct financial stake in an honest count, and disputes over a hidden or undervalued item were taken seriously enough to be, on some documented crews, punishable by marooning if proven. 2 crewmen are posted specifically to watch the hold while the inventory proceeds, not because anyone particularly suspects the quartermaster of dishonesty, but because the articles specify the watch as a standing procedure regardless of who holds the office, a built-in check against temptation that assumes, reasonably enough, that any man might be tempted given the chance, and structures the process so the chance never quite arrives. The quartermaster doing this work isn't performing an act of charity. He's performing the single most trusted and most closely watched job on the ship, precisely because a dishonest quartermaster would very quickly find himself voted out, or worse. Your own crew's prize tonight is a far more ordinary catch, worth reckoning against the true outer edge of what this profession could occasionally deliver. In September of 1695, a pirate captain named Henry Every, commanding a ship called the Fancy, intercepted a Mughal Indian treasure ship named the Ganges Sawai in the Arabian Sea, returning from a pilgrimage voyage to Mecca laden with gold, silver, and jewels belonging to some of the wealthiest passengers in the Mughal Empire. The resulting haul, based on period estimates and the substantial diplomatic fallout it caused between the English crown and Mughal authorities furious at the attack, is thought to have been worth somewhere in the range of 600,000 in the currency of the day, a figure so large that individual crewmen, once the loot was divided under their own ship's articles, may each have walked away with something on the order of £1,000 or more, an almost unimaginable sum for a common sailor, equivalent to what an honest seaman might have needed several lifetimes of ordinary naval wages to accumulate. Every himself vanished afterward and was never captured, becoming one of the few successful pirates of the era to seemingly retire in genuine comfort rather than end on a gallows or at the bottom of the sea, though notably, several of his crew who did not vanish so successfully were eventually caught and tried in London, giving historians independent testimony about the scale of the haul and how it was divided. It's the outlier case, the one every desperate sailor weighing his own arithmetic had at least heard whispered about, and it explains a great deal about why men kept signing articles even after hearing about all the ships that hanged. The division itself happens on deck, often the same day or the day after, and it's worth walking through the arithmetic one more time now that you've seen it in action, rather than simply described. This particular prize, once fully appraised, comes to a total value the quartermaster reckons at just under 2,000 pieces of 8, once cargo, coin, and the ship's own saleable value are all accounted for, a genuinely significant sum, though far short of the largest hauls of the era. For comparison, when the pirate captain Samuel Black Sam Bellamy captured the slave ship Wider Galley in February of 1717 off the coast of the Bahamas, the vessel is estimated, based on the substantial hoard later recovered from her wreck site after its rediscovery in 1984, to have been carrying something in the range of tens of thousands of pounds sterling in gold, silver, and other valuables at the time she was taken, one of the single richest pirate captures of the entire Golden Age, and proof that a lucky crew's fortunes could shift, almost overnight, from modest to genuinely life-changing. Your own crew's prize tonight is a far more ordinary one, but the process is identical regardless of scale, shares counted out on the open deck, coin by coin where coin is involved, cargo valued and divided where it isn't, every man watching every other man's portion get weighed out in full view, because transparency on a pirate ship wasn't a courtesy. It was the entire mechanism, that kept 200 armed and frequently short-tempered men from turning on each other over a suspected shortchange. Tunstall watches his own first share get counted out with an expression that's hard to read, relief, maybe, or the beginning of a different and darker fear entirely. Because a forced man who signs the articles and later takes a share of stolen goods has, in the eyes of Admiralty law, made himself considerably harder to defend if the ship is ever caught. The forced man defence, the argument that a sailor's presence aboard a pirate vessel resulted from coercion rather than choice, and was therefore not a capital crime, was a real, recognised, and sometimes successful legal argument at pirate trials of this era. Several men from Bartholomew Roberts's own crew, tried after the battle off Cape Lopez, were acquitted or given lighter sentences specifically because witnesses and their own testimony convinced the court they had genuinely been forced. But the defence worked best for men who could show they'd taken no active part in plunder, fought no battles, and drawn no shares, and the moment Tunstall's name goes into the quartermaster's ledger next to a specific sum of pieces of 8. That argument gets measurably harder to make should it ever come to a courtroom. He knows this. He takes his share anyway, because the alternative, refusing it and marking himself as untrustworthy to a crew he now depends on entirely for his survival, carries its own, more immediate risk. It's worth pausing here to set this whole system against the Navy's version of the same basic transaction, the prize money process described earlier, because the contrast sharpens considerably once you've watched both unfold. A Navy sailor's prize share, however large the captured vessel, had to pass through a formal Admiralty prize court, months or years of legal processing, and a distribution formula weighted heavily toward officers and an absent admiral before an ordinary seaman saw a fraction of it, often as another paper ticket rather than actual coin. Somewhere on a king's ship right now, doing the exact same job you're doing, a pressed sailor who helped take a genuinely valuable prize might not see a farthing of it for 2 or 3 years, and might, by the time the paperwork finally clears, have already sold his claim to a broker on Tower Hill for half its worth. The same as Thomas Yeoman did with his wage ticket. Tunstall's share, by contrast, is in his hand, literal coin, weighed and counted on an open deck within roughly 48 hours of the ship's capture. There is no court. There is no admiral taking an unearned cut for a battle he wasn't present at. There is a quartermaster, elected by the same men he's now paying, and a pile of silver getting smaller as it moves down the line. No prey, no pay cut both ways, brutally on the bad weeks. But on a week like this one, it meant a forced carpenter with blood on his hands he never asked for walked away richer, by nightfall, than 4 years of honest naval wages would have made him. 3 weeks later, your ship takes a second prize, smaller, less dramatic. A coastal trading sloop out of Charleston carrying rice and indigo rather than coin. And the routine repeats itself with a kind of practiced ease that would have seemed impossible to you 6 months earlier. The boarding goes almost gently by comparison to your first, the sloop's captain. An older man who has clearly heard enough stories to know better than to resist. Has his colours down before your own vessel has even finished closing the distance. There's a strange, almost business-like calm to the whole encounter, closer to a routine customs inspection than anything resembling the violence you'd braced yourself for back when you first signed the articles. What's changed, watching it this second time, is your attention to the parts of the process that protect the crew's weakest members rather than just the parts that enrich the strongest ones. The quartermaster sets aside a portion of this prize's value, before any shares are counted at all, into what the crew simply calls the common fund. The same reserve that paid Cuffy for his burned hand back at the start of this voyage, replenished now quietly, before anyone's individual share is even calculated. Nobody has to be reminded to do this. It's simply built into the order of operations. The same way setting aside seed grain for next year's planting would have been built into any prudent farmer's harvest. A system that pays its wounded promptly, it turns out, isn't an accident that happens after the money's divided. It's a decision made before the money's divided, every single time, by men who understand exactly how quickly their own circumstances could change. That night, once the second prize has been let go on her way, stripped of her rice and indigo but otherwise unharmed, her crew unhurt, which was standard practice for a ship that hadn't resisted, Tunstall sits apart from the others for a while, turning his share of coin over in his hands without counting it again, since he's already counted it 3 times. You sit down near him, not too close, and after a while he tells you, without much prompting, about a wife in Charleston he hasn't written to since the night his old ship was taken, because he doesn't know what he'd say to her. "I'm a carpenter," he says. "I fix broken things. I don't know how to fix this." You don't have an answer for him, and you don't try to invent one. There isn't a clean one to give. The articles that pay him fairly and the noose that waits if he's ever caught are the same piece of paper, in the end, and no amount of coin in his sea chest changes that arithmetic, only makes it heavier to carry. It's a quiet moment, and the crew, moving around the two of you at a respectful distance, seems to understand without being told that this isn't a moment for a joke or a song. Some nights, even on a ship built around plunder and rough camaraderie, the only decent thing left to do is sit with a man in what he's lost, rather than try too quickly to talk him out of feeling it. Tunstall, by the time your ship makes for open water again, has stopped flinching every time someone calls him carpenter instead of by his name, which the quartermaster takes, correctly, as a sign the man has more or less settled into his new and complicated life, however uneasily. He hasn't forgotten what it cost him to get here, or what it might cost him later if a king's ship ever catches this crew, with the wind against them. But for tonight at least, there's a share of Charleston rice and indigo divided fairly in his sea chest, counted out in front of every man aboard, and no admiral 3,000 miles away who's going to skim a cut off the top before it reaches him. All of this, the votes, the fair counts, the reserved fund, the swift and transparent division, depended on one office holding the whole arrangement together day to day, far more than the captain's own authority ever did. The captain led the chase and the fight, when there was one. Everything you just watched happen on that open deck, from the honest count to the reserved fund to the choice offered to a frightened carpenter, ran through a different man entirely, elected separately, answerable separately, and in many ways more powerful in the ordinary run of a voyage than the captain himself. It's time to properly meet the quartermaster. Harry Glasby stood on the deck of the Royal Fortune in early 1722, facing a jury of his own shipmates, and unlike almost every other trial this story has touched on tonight, this one wasn't taking place in a colonial courtroom with the full weight of English law behind it. It was taking place on the deck of the ship he'd tried to leave, in front of the very men whose articles he'd signed and then attempted to break, under an open sky with no judge's robes or formal legal language to soften the proceedings, and the verdict they were about to reach carried, for him, exactly the same finality a king's courts would have. Glasby had served as sailing master under Bartholomew Roberts, a skilled and valuable navigator whose expertise had helped guide the Royal Fortune across thousands of miles of open ocean, through weather and unfamiliar coastlines, on a career that by this point had already claimed hundreds of prizes. At some point during the voyage, worn down by a life he had never fully chosen, he had tried to slip away from the crew during a stop ashore, taking the chance to simply walk off into a life that wasn't piracy anymore, back toward whatever ordinary existence still felt possible to him. He was caught before he'd gotten far. Under the articles every man aboard had sworn to, desertion was a capital offence, no exception made for rank or skill or the years of loyal navigation that had come before, and the crew. Following their own written law rather than any captain's unilateral whim, put the question of Glasby's fate to a formal vote, the same procedure that would have governed any other man's trial for the same offence. This is the story of the quartermaster, the office and the man that made a trial like this even possible in the first place. Because without a quartermaster's authority running in parallel to the captain's, and without the culture of shared governance that office represented, there would have been no vote at all. There would simply have been a rope. To understand why a scene like Glasby's trial could happen at all, you have to understand what a quartermaster actually was aboard a pirate ship, because the title is easy to misread through a modern lens. A quartermaster wasn't a lower-ranking assistant to the captain, the way the word might suggest in a more conventional military hierarchy. He was a separately elected officer, chosen by the same crew-wide vote that chose the captain, and his authority ran on a genuinely different track than the captain's did. The captain held near absolute power during a chase and during battle. Nobody voted on tactics in the middle of a broadside. But the moment the fighting stopped, a great deal of the ship's actual daily governance reverted to the quartermaster, who managed the distribution of food and plunder, adjudicated disputes between crew members, held the keys to the ship's stores, and served, in practice, as a check against a captain who might otherwise be tempted to abuse the considerable power battle conditions handed him. Some surviving accounts describe the quartermaster as effectively holding a form of veto over the captain's proposed division of especially valuable plunder, a check with real teeth precisely because the crew, not the captain, had put him there and could just as easily take the office away again. It's a genuinely unusual division of labour for the era, two separately elected officers with genuinely separate spheres of authority, each answerable to the same voting body of common sailors, neither one able to simply overrule the other outside his own defined domain. The roots of the office trace back to the same buccaneer traditions that produced the articles themselves, and to ordinary merchant shipping practice as well, where a quartermaster's role, overseeing stores, provisions, and the practical daily running of the ship below the captain's level, was a long-established and unremarkable position across most of the English maritime world. A merchant vessel's quartermaster, in the legitimate trade, might handle much the same paperwork and provisioning duties without a shred of the elected authority or political weight the office carried aboard a pirate ship. What pirate crews did with the office was expand it dramatically, turning a largely administrative role into something closer to an elected tribune, a position whose entire purpose, in practice, was to represent the interests of the common crew against the concentrated power any captain might otherwise accumulate. It's worth noting, too, that this expansion didn't happen all at once or by any single crew's deliberate design. It developed gradually, across dozens of overlapping and interconnected pirate crews through the 1710s and 1720s, many of whom shared members back and forth as ships changed hands, were captured or split apart, carrying institutional habits and expectations with them from one vessel to the next, the way an experienced worker might carry a trade's unwritten customs from one shop to another. Marcus Rediker and other historians who have studied the social structure of Golden Age piracy in detail have described this dual authority system as one of the more genuinely democratic features of pirate governance, a structural safeguard built by men who had, in many cases, personally suffered under captains and officers with no such check on their power, and who were determined not to recreate that same vulnerability for themselves. It is one of the more curious ironies of the entire period that men fleeing tyranny of the pettiest, most personal kind, an abusive mate, a captain who played favourites, an officer who skimmed the ration and dared anyone to complain, built, almost by instinct, a system of checks and balances that political theorists writing in more respectable circles wouldn't formalise into comparable language for the better part of another century. The quartermaster's power to override a captain outside of battle wasn't merely theoretical, and the surviving trial depositions from Robert's crew, taken independently from dozens of separate men at Cape Coast Castle, describe more than one instance of exactly this kind of check being exercised in practice. A captain who wanted to punish a crewman for some perceived offence could be, and on more than one documented occasion was, overruled by the quartermaster, who held that the punishment exceeded what the articles actually specified for the offence in question. It's the pirate ship's version of a shop steward stepping between an angry foreman and the worker he's about to discipline unfairly, and it's worth remembering that this authority existed nowhere else on the ocean in this era, not on a merchant vessel, where a captain's word was close to absolute, and certainly not on a navy ship, where the Articles of War gave a commanding officer sweeping disciplinary power with no elected counterweight of any kind standing between him and the men under his command. Which brings the story back to Glaspie, standing before his own crew's vote with his life genuinely on the line. According to the surviving depositions, 2 other pirates aboard, men who had served alongside Glasby and evidently valued him, whether for his skill as a navigator or simply out of personal loyalty built up over months of shared danger, spoke up in his defence during the trial, arguing forcefully enough for leniency that they reportedly offered, in some form, to share responsibility or accept punishment alongside him, rather than see him hanged or marooned alone. It's a remarkable thing to picture, 2 armed men in front of the assembled crew, putting their own standing and safety on the line to argue for a shipmate's life, in a setting where the easier and safer path would simply have been to stay silent and let the vote run its course without complication. The vote that followed spared his life. Glasby survived the encounter that had every reason to kill him, not through any captain's mercy, since Roberts himself had no particular say in the outcome once the matter went to the crew, but through the same democratic machinery that governed everything else aboard this ship, the machinery the quartermaster's office existed specifically to protect and administer. It's a genuinely striking scene to have survived in the historical record at all. A capital trial, conducted by the accused's own peers, ending not in a foregone conclusion, but in a contested, emotional vote that came down, in the end, on the side of mercy, in a setting where mercy was never guaranteed and where the articles themselves would have fully justified the opposite outcome. Set this against the Navy's own system of shipboard justice, and the contrast is stark enough to be almost uncomfortable. A Royal Navy court-martial, the formal mechanism for trying a sailor accused of a serious offence, was composed entirely of commissioned officers, never common sailors, never anyone remotely resembling a jury of the accused man's actual peers. The Articles of War specified the charges and, for many offences, mandated the punishment outright, leaving officers presiding over the court comparatively little discretion, even if they were personally inclined toward leniency. An ordinary seaman accused of striking an officer, sleeping on watch, or desertion faced judges drawn exclusively from the same class of men who held authority over him every single day, with no mechanism whatsoever for 2 sympathetic shipmates to stand up and argue, successfully, for his life the way Glasby's did. The rigidity of the system didn't spare even the men at the very top of the Navy's own hierarchy, which is worth knowing, because it shows the harshness wasn't reserved only for the powerless. In 1757, Admiral John Byng was court-martialed for failing to relieve a besieged British garrison at Minorca the previous year, a strategic failure judged, under the Articles of War's own uncompromising wording, to constitute a failure to do his utmost against the enemy, an offence that, as written, carried a mandatory sentence of death, with the court itself expressing regret that it had no legal discretion to impose anything lesser, despite recommending clemency. Byng was executed by firing squad aboard Hms Monarch in March of that year, a sentence the French writer Voltaire would later immortalise with grim irony as an execution carried out, in his words, to encourage the others, a phrase that has outlived almost everything else about the case. If an admiral, with every advantage of rank, connection and public sympathy, could be shot for a battlefield judgment call the court itself seemed uneasy about condemning, it says a great deal about how little room the system left for an ordinary pressed sailor facing the same rigid machinery over a far smaller offence. It's not that Navy officers were uniquely cruel as individuals. Many surviving accounts describe genuinely compassionate captains who used what limited discretion they had to temper harsh sentences. It's that the system itself, structurally, offered no equivalent to what Glasby experienced. No elected advocate, no peer jury, no built-in mechanism by which the men actually serving alongside the accused could collectively decide his fate. The quartermaster's authority, like everything else built into the pirate articles, had real and important limits, and it's worth being honest about where the system broke down, rather than presenting it as flawless. The office carried no protection whatsoever once real violence actually began. A quartermaster's careful mediation meant nothing in the chaos of a boarding action or a running gun battle, where raw survival instinct and the captain's tactical authority took over completely, and the system depended, ultimately, on the ongoing goodwill and rough consensus of the crew itself. A sufficiently divided or embittered company could still descend into exactly the kind of violent internal conflict the articles were designed to prevent, and pirate history records more than one crew that did precisely that, quartermaster's office notwithstanding. Charles Vane's own deposition by his crew, described earlier, was itself only possible because enough of the crew agreed on the outcome. Had the vote split more evenly, the result might have been outright mutiny and bloodshed rather than an orderly transfer of command. Some pirate crews, less fortunate or less disciplined than Roberts, are recorded splitting apart entirely over exactly this kind of unresolved dispute. A faction unhappy with a vote's outcome simply seizing a boat and abandoning the rest, or, in rarer and uglier cases, coming to blows that the quartermaster's authority proved powerless to prevent once tempers had already crossed a certain threshold. Democracy aboard a pirate ship was resilient enough to handle most ordinary disputes remarkably well, but it was never so robust that it could survive a genuinely irreconcilable split within the crew itself, and every man aboard, Glasby included, understood on some level that the fairness of the system he depended on was only ever as strong as the crew's continued willingness to abide by its own rules. Bartholomew Roberts' own quartermaster, a man named in some surviving accounts, though the historical record here again leans partly on Johnson's disputed authorship and should be read with appropriate caution, served alongside him through the bulk of the extraordinary run of captures that made Roberts, by volume, arguably the most successful pirate captain of the entire era. Beyond the dramatic set-piece of a capital trial, the quartermaster's daily work involved a steady stream of far smaller disputes. And it's worth dwelling on the ordinary version of the job for a moment, since the grand trials tend to overshadow just how much of this office was, day to day, closer to running a small and quarrelsome workplace than presiding over life and death drama. Two crewmen arguing over who was owed a slightly larger cut of a divided cargo because he'd been first up the rigging during the boarding. A dispute over whose watch had let a prize's crew slip a small item of value out of the official count before the hold was properly inventoried. A quarrel that started over a card game and threatened to end in drawn knives before the quartermaster stepped. Bodily between the two men, and reminded them, in terms the surviving depositions describe as considerably less polite than this retelling, that the articles specifically forbade settling disputes aboard ship, and that any grievance serious enough to demand blood would have to wait for a formal duel ashore, witnessed and stopped at first blood. It was unglamorous work, mediating the small grinding friction of 200 armed men living in close quarters for months at a stretch, and it fell day after day to one elected man whose real authority came from nothing more than the crew's continued willingness to respect the office, which meant, in practice, that a quartermaster who ruled unfairly even a handful of times could expect to find himself voted out at the next opportunity, same as any captain. This is the story of the office that made Roberts's whole system function day to day, the office that turned a written set of articles into a living, enforced reality rather than merely words on parchment. When the Swallow's guns found Roberts off Cape Lopez, the quartermaster's authority ended in the same instant the captain's did. For the same reason, neither democracy nor discretion nor careful mediation survives a broadside. But for as long as the ship sailed, the office had done exactly what it was built to do, keeping 200 armed men from turning on each other and giving a frightened navigator, once, an actual chance to be heard before his own crew decided whether he would live or die. Modern historians examining the social structure of Golden Age piracy have increasingly pointed to the quartermaster's office as one of the more remarkable and unexpected features of the period, a genuine, if rough and imperfect, form of worker-elected representation, checks on concentrated authority, and peer adjudication operating on the high seas, roughly a century and a half before organised labour movements would begin building comparable institutions into the legitimate economies of Britain and the United States. None of this makes the men who built it saints, or their trade anything other than what it plainly was: theft and violence, conducted against merchant crews who mostly wanted nothing more than to deliver their cargo and go home. But the institutions they built to govern themselves, imperfect and occasionally brutal as they could be, deserve to be understood on their own terms rather than dismissed as mere criminal chaos with no organising principle behind it. It's a strange legacy for men who were, by any legal definition of their own time, criminals facing the gallows. But the office they built, however briefly it lasted aboard any single ship, worked well enough to save Harry Glasby's life on a specific afternoon in early 1722, which is more than can be said for whatever formal mercy the Crown's own courts might have offered a Navy deserter caught in the same circumstances. There was one more place this whole system was tested most severely of all. Not in a dispute over punishment or a contested vote, but in the moment a man's body was actually broken, and the Article's promises had to be paid out in blood as well as coin. It's worth closing this chapter with one final thought on why the quartermaster's office mattered as much as it did, beyond even the specific dramas of Glasby's trial or the daily disputes it settled. A ship is, in the end, a genuinely small and enclosed world, a few 100 feet of timber holding 200 men who cannot simply walk away from each other for months at a stretch, cannot take a night to cool off in separate houses, cannot appeal to any outside authority if things go wrong between them. Every other institution this story has examined tonight, the Royal Navy's court-martial, its distant chest at Chatham, its pay office queue on Tower Hill, assumed the existence of some larger world beyond the ship. Some office or authority a wronged man could eventually appeal to, however slowly. A pirate crew had no such larger world to appeal to. Whatever justice existed entirely within the hull of the ship itself, invented and administered by the very men who needed it to work, and the quartermaster's office was, in the truest sense, the load-bearing wall of that entire structure. Take it away, and there is no reason to believe the Article's fine promises about equal shares and fair compensation would have meant anything at all beyond the ink they were written in. A lesson every man aboard understood instinctively, even if none of them would have phrased it in quite these terms over their evening ration of bumbo. The smell reaches you before the pain fully does, scorched powder, hot iron, and underneath it something coppery and wet that your body recognises as blood before your mind has caught up to what's just happened. A swivel gun has misfired during a skirmish with a Portuguese trading vessel that decided, against all sensible odds, to put up a fight, and a fragment of its shattered barrel has caught you across the lower leg. The deck under your cheek is warm from the afternoon sun, still faintly smelling of the tar used to seal its seams. An oddly ordinary detail to notice in a moment that is anything but ordinary. You're back aboard the pirate sloop, further along now in a voyage that has taught you more about your own body's limits than you ever expected to learn. And for one long, suspended moment, flat on the deck, with the fight still going on somewhere above you, the noise of the guns oddly distant now, muffled, as though your ears have decided to protect you from at least one more sensation on top of. Everything else you understand with total clarity that the next few minutes are going to determine what the rest of your life looks like. The compensation clause you're about to benefit from wasn't limited only to the dramatic case of a limb lost in open battle, either, and it's worth understanding the fuller shape of it before the quartermaster arrives with his accounts. Several surviving sets of pirate articles extend a version of the same protection to sickness and disease contracted in the ship's service as well, not only to wounds taken in a fight, a real, if less dramatic, form of ongoing support for a crew that spent long stretches exposed to fevers, dysentery, and the general hazards of tropical Atlantic sailing with no proper hospital anywhere within reach. This matters because it shows the compensation clause wasn't simply battle insurance dressed up as generosity. It reflected something closer to a genuine, if informal, understanding that a man's ability to work and earn his share could be taken from him by causes that had nothing to do with cannon fire at all, and that the same collective fund ought to answer for both. The Royal Navy, for its part, did eventually build something resembling an equivalent institution, the Royal Hospital for Seamen at Greenwich, founded in 1694 specifically to house and care for wounded, sick and elderly sailors of the Navy, a genuinely impressive architectural and charitable achievement that still stands today. But Greenwich Hospital, however grand its buildings, could only ever house a limited number of men at any given time. admission required navigating its own formal application process, and it offered shelter and care rather than the kind of immediate cash payment that let a man like you keep some control over his own circumstances, choosing where to go and how to live rather than depending on continued residence within an institution's walls for the rest of his days. What happens next is not what you braced yourself for, back when you first signed the articles and heard, second-hand, the way most sailors heard everything, about what a ship's surgeon's work actually involved. Someone is shouting for Dr. Rook before you've even fully processed that you're the one who's hurt. And within what feels like seconds, but was probably closer to a minute, a lean, sharp-eyed man in a blood-stained coat is kneeling over your leg, cutting away the ruined fabric of your breeches with a small, well-worn knife, talking to you the entire time in a low, steady voice that has nothing gentle about its content and everything gentle about its tone. Absalom Rook was, until 8 months ago, a surgeon's mate aboard a Liverpool slaving vessel, taken off that ship the same way Cuffy was, and pressed into service the same way Tunstall was, surgeons being, alongside carpenters and navigators, among the most consistently forced professions in the entire pirate trade, since a skilled medical man was simply too valuable to let walk away, and too rare to expect one to volunteer. Rook has told you, in an idler moment weeks before this injury, that he never once considered himself cut out for piracy. That he'd trained for years under a Liverpool physician expecting a quiet, respectable career, and that the sea took that expectation from him just as thoroughly, if less violently, as the swivel gun is about to take your leg. There's a particular kind of dark humour men in his position sometimes develop, a way of holding the absurdity of their circumstance at arm's length, and Rook's version of it, you'll learn over the coming weeks, involves a running, deadpan commentary on the various ways the human body can fail, delivered in the same flat, unbothered tone, whether the injury in question is a splinter or, as in your case today, considerably worse. Rook's tools, laid out now on a strip of canvas beside your leg, are the same tools any navy or merchant surgeon of this era would have carried. A bone saw, a set of probes for locating shot or fragments, a tourniquet, needle and silk thread for closing what could be closed, and precious little else in the way of actual medicine beyond a bottle of rum, which is about to become, in the next several minutes, the closest thing to anaesthesia the 18th century has to offer anyone in your position. There's no version of what happens next that isn't brutal. Rook works fast, because speed itself was understood correctly as one of the only real defences against shock and blood loss available to 18th century medicine. And the sound of the saw against bone is a sound you will remember for the rest of your life, however long that turns out to be. We know a great deal about exactly how procedures like this one were performed in this era, not from guesswork, but from surviving surgeons' kits recovered from period shipwrecks and from trial depositions in which surviving pirates described, sometimes in considerable and unflinching detail, exactly what happened to a wounded shipmate during and after a fight, a grim but genuinely well-documented body of evidence. You lose the leg below the knee. There's no version of this story where that detail gets softened, because softening it would dishonour exactly how real and how permanent this cost actually was for men who lived through it. What happens next, though, is the part that would have seemed almost unbelievable to you a year ago, before any of this became your life. Once Rook has finished, and once you're stable enough for the ship's business to resume its ordinary rhythm around you, the quartermaster comes to your side, not tomorrow, not next week, but that same evening, once the fighting has fully stopped and the immediate crisis has passed, with the ship's rough accounts and a question that isn't really a question at all, since the crew has already. In the time it took Rook to finish his work, held the brief, informal vote the articles require to confirm what everyone aboard already understood to be true: a leg lost in the ship's service, no argument, no appeal needed. The sum owed to you, according to the articles this crew sails under, sits in the range the surviving trial records describe for a lost leg or arm, several hundred pieces of 8 at minimum, with the specific figure of 800 showing up often enough across surviving accounts of pirate articles from this period, John Phillips among them, that it's reasonable to treat it as a broadly representative sum, even allowing for some variation from crew to crew and voyage to voyage. Sit with the timeline of that for a moment, because the timeline is the entire point. You lost your leg this afternoon. By this evening, before the sun has even fully set, a sum of money large enough to represent, by some rough modern estimates, several years of an honest sailor's ordinary wages has been formally voted, recorded, and set aside for you from the ship's common stock, waiting to be paid out the moment shares are next divided. There is no petition to file. There is no board of trustees in a distant city reviewing your paperwork at their own unhurried pace. There is no purser's discretion, no admiral's approval required, no possibility that the claim simply gets lost somewhere between one office and another. The men who owe you this money are standing on the same deck you're lying on, and they have exactly as much reason to want the system to work reliably as you do, since any one of them could be the next man Rook has to operate on. The quartermaster reads the sum aloud, plainly, without ceremony, the way he'd read out any other line in the ship's accounts, and asks if you understand and agree it's correctly recorded. A small, almost bureaucratic courtesy that nonetheless strikes you, lying there with your leg newly bound and your head still swimming from the rum Rook poured into you before the saw ever touched bone, as one of the more startling kindnesses anyone has shown you in your entire life. You nod. It's recorded. It's done. Rook's own position aboard this ship carries a complicated undercurrent that's worth sitting with honestly, because his skill doesn't erase the coercion that brought him here in the first place. He didn't choose this life any more than Tunstall did, and he carries, quietly, the same knowledge Tunstall carries, that if this ship is ever taken by a king's vessel, his considerable skill won't automatically save him from the gallows, whatever mercy the forced man defence might theoretically offer. What it might do, and what surviving trial records suggest it sometimes actually did, is give him a genuinely stronger legal argument than an ordinary crewman would have, since a captured ship's log or a fellow prisoner's testimony describing a surgeon working under obvious duress, treating friend and captive alike without apparent enthusiasm for the trade itself, carried real weight before an admiralty court weighing the difference between a willing pirate and a forced one. More than one surgeon swept up in a pirate crew's eventual capture, and trial was acquitted on exactly this basis across the Golden Age's various documented court proceedings, their skill working, in the end, in their favour rather than against them. Not every wound Rook treats ends as well as yours does, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. 3 weeks after your own injury, a topman named Edward Marsh takes a length of shattered rigging across the ribs during a sudden squall, and though Rook does everything the era's medicine allows, cleaning the wound as thoroughly as the tools available to him permit, watching over Marsh through the first uncertain nights, trying remedies that period medical practice offered even knowing, in his own private assessment shared quietly with you afterward, that none of them were likely to be enough. An infection sets in within days that no amount of skill or rum or careful attention can turn back. Marsh dies 6 days after the accident, and the ship observes his loss the way this crew observes most losses, not with elaborate ceremony, no priest, no formal service beyond a few words spoken by the captain and whoever else wishes to speak, but with a quiet, genuine grief that moves through the company for longer than anyone quite expects. Men going about their duties a little more silently than usual for the better part of a week, and with his own promised compensation, since death in the ship's service carried its own provision under the articles, paid out in full to the shipmate he'd named, before his injury, as the man who should receive it in his place. It's a detail worth sitting with, rather than rushing past, even in death, the system held. There was no dispute, no argument that the debt had somehow evaporated along with the man it was owed to, no captain deciding, on his own authority, that the sum could be quietly reduced or set aside for the ship's own use instead. The named beneficiary simply received what the articles promised, and the crew moved forward carrying that loss the way any crew carries the ones it couldn't save. Not forgetting exactly, but folding the grief into the ordinary rhythm of the voyage, because the voyage, and the danger it still held for everyone aboard, didn't pause to let them grieve any longer than that. There's no joke to make about Marsh's death. and this chapter isn't going to try to find one. Some things earn silence rather than a wry aside, and a young topman's slow decline over 6 days, watched helplessly by a surgeon who did everything available to him and still lost the fight, is one of them. What there is, instead, is the quiet fact of the payment that followed, and the quiet fact that Rook sat with Marsh through most of those final 6 days when his other duties allowed it, not because the articles required anything of the kind, but because it was, in Rook's own words to you afterward, simply what a person does. By your 2nd month recovering, fitted now with a rough wooden peg carved by Tunstall himself, who took to the task with the same careful attention he brings to every piece of ship's carpentry, you've rejoined the crew's ordinary rhythm in whatever reduced capacity your leg allows, and you've discovered something you hadn't expected going in. The ship has no particular use for pity, but it has considerable use for you anyway. Cuffy brings you food during the worst of the first week without being asked, the same sharp nod he gave you back on your very first morning aboard, now carrying a different, quieter weight to it. And Tunstall sits with you some evenings measuring your stump for the peg with the same patient precision he'd bring to fitting a plank against a hull. Talking, while he works, about his wife in Charleston, the letter he still hasn't managed to write, the strange, complicated gratitude he feels toward a ship that pays him fairly for a life he never chose. It occurs to you, listening to him, that the two of you have become something neither of you quite has a name for. Not friends in any way either of you would have recognized before all this, but something built out of shared risk and a shared unlikely fairness, which turns out to be its own kind of bond, sturdier in some ways than the ones you left behind on land, and stranger to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. Your share of duties shifts toward work that doesn't require 2 working legs, keeping the ship's rough accounts alongside the quartermaster. Standing watch where balance matters less than eyesight, and nobody frames this as charity, because the articles don't frame anything as charity. You're owed a place aboard this ship for as long as you can contribute to it, the same as anyone, and the compensation already paid out for your leg was never meant to replace that place, only to acknowledge, in hard coin, what the ship's service had actually cost you. Compare all of this, one final time, to what waited for Davy Cobb after his own leg was lost aboard a king's ship in the exact same era, doing the exact same kind of work in the exact same kind of fight. No vote that evening. No sum set aside from a common stock before anyone else's pay was touched. No quartermaster kneeling beside him with a ledger and a question that was really a formality, because the answer had never been in doubt. Just a slow, uncertain application working its way through an office in Chatham, filed by a 14-year-old boy with one leg, competing for attention and funding against hundreds of similar claims from men wounded in a war effort that never seemed to stop needing more of them, and a weight he had no way to shorten and no leverage whatsoever to speed along. 2 boys, roughly the same age, losing roughly the same limb in roughly the same kind of accident, on 2 different kinds of ships, flying 2 very different flags, and only one of them found a system built, deliberately and by shared consent, to actually take care of him, while the other found a piece of paper and an office 300 miles from where he lay recovering, and a promise that help would come eventually, in whatever amount and at whatever pace an institution he'd never meet decided was appropriate. That difference, between a system built by outlaws to protect its own, and a legitimate government that couldn't manage the same basic decency for 3/4 of a century more, is the one that finally, eventually, forced a reckoning. It just took the Crown's own sailors mutinying to make it happen. There's a quieter kind of wonder worth sitting with before this chapter closes, separate from the grim arithmetic of shillings and pieces of 8. What Rook and the quartermaster and the whole ship's company built around your injury wasn't charity, and it wasn't sentiment, and none of the men involved would have described it in those terms if you'd asked them. It was self-interest, clear-eyed and unromantic, dressed up as fairness, because fairness was the only version of self-interest that could actually hold 200 armed men together for months at a stretch, without them turning on each other. And yet, watching Tunstall measure your stump with such evident care, watching Cuffy bring food without being asked, Watching Rook sit with a dying man for 6 days when nothing in the articles required it of him, it becomes hard to draw a clean line between the cold calculation that built this system and the genuine human decency that ended up living inside it once it was built. Maybe that's true of most fairness, in the end, however it comes about. It starts as arithmetic. Somewhere along the way, if you're lucky, it becomes something closer to care, and it becomes very hard, once you've lived inside it, to remember which one it started as. At dawn on June the 30th, 1797, a man named Richard Parker was led up onto the deck of His Majesty's ship Sandwich, anchored at the Nore, the stretch of the Thames estuary where the river meets the open sea, to be hanged from the ship's own yardarm in front of an assembled fleet ordered to watch. Its crews mustered on deck in silence to witness exactly the kind of public, deterrent punishment this story has already seen visited on Fletcher's back, and in a far more extreme form, on Admiral Byng's own body decades before. He had, weeks earlier, been elected by his fellow sailors to a position his own crewmates only half-jokingly called President of the Delegates, an elected representative, chosen by vote, to speak for the grievances of tens of thousands of Royal Navy seamen, who had, that spring, done something no King's fleet had ever done at this scale before. They had mutinied, not for glory, not to defect to an enemy, but for pay that hadn't been raised since 1653, for food they could trust, and for basic sick pay and decent treatment for men wounded in the King's own service. Parker's final words, according to multiple witnesses present that morning, expressed no regret for the cause itself, only for how it had ended, a distinction his own accusers seemed to find more unsettling than open defiance would have been. This is the story of the mutinies at Spithead and the Nore, the moment, 3/4 of a century after Bartholomew Roberts signed his own crew's articles, that the Crown's sailors finally forced their government to grant, under threat of open rebellion, some of the very things pirate crews had simply voted themselves into existence generations before, without waiting for anyone's permission at all. To understand why 1797 became the breaking point, you have to understand just how long the underlying grievances had actually been accumulating, because none of what follows happened suddenly. Royal Navy pay for an able seaman had last been formally raised in 1653 during the Commonwealth period under Oliver Cromwell, and had simply never been adjusted since, not through the Restoration, not through decades of subsequent wars, not through more than a century of steady inflation that eroded the real value of that fixed wage year after year, while the cost of everything a sailor's family actually needed to buy kept climbing. By 1797, an able seaman's pay, unchanged for 144 years, had become, in real terms, a genuinely inadequate wage. And every other grievance this story has already walked through, the purser's dishonest pound, the slow and uncertain ticket system, the meagre and poorly administered chest at Chatham, had simply continued accumulating on top of that stagnant base pay for the entire intervening century and a half. Britain, by the spring of 1797, was also deep into a costly and increasingly desperate war against revolutionary France, a conflict that had swollen the fleet's manpower needs dramatically through renewed and more aggressive impressment, even as it did nothing whatsoever to address the pay and provisioning complaints that had been quietly building in every mess deck across the Navy for a generation. It is, in hindsight, difficult to imagine a more combustible combination, a fleet larger and more essential to national survival than it had ever been, staffed increasingly by men who had never chosen to be there, all of them nursing exactly the kind of long, simmering, entirely reasonable grievances that, once organised, proved considerably harder for the Admiralty to simply ignore than any single ship's individual complaint ever could have been. The Spithead Mutiny began first, in mid-April of 1797, among the Channel Fleet anchored at Spithead, near Portsmouth. And it is worth pausing on how it began, because the manner of it says a great deal about what the sailors actually wanted. This wasn't a spontaneous riot or an act of chaotic violence. It was a coordinated, disciplined, almost eerily orderly protest, organised through elected delegates chosen from each ship in the fleet, typically 2 men per vessel, selected by their own crewmates, in a process that period accounts describe as remarkably calm and procedural given the stakes involved, a structure that, whether the sailors involved were consciously aware of the echo or not, bears an unmistakable resemblance to the crew votes and elected quartermasters that governed pirate ships 3 generations earlier. The delegates drew up a formal list of demands, committed to writing and circulated ship to ship for approval before being formally presented to the Admiralty. A pay raise, the first in a century and a half, the abolition of the purser's pound and other short-weight practices in the provisioning of food, better quality food generally, particularly fresh meat and vegetables when in port, echoing almost precisely the kind of provisioning complaint that had driven so many desperate sailors toward piracy generations earlier. Proper pay for sailors wounded and sent to naval hospitals, rather than the uncertain, drawn-out process the chest at Chatham had offered for 2 centuries, and shore leave, so that men confined aboard ship for months or years at a time could actually set foot on land when their ship was safely in port, rather than being kept aboard out of the Navy's own fear that they would simply walk away. Given the chance, the exact same fear that had kept an earlier sailor watching Gibraltar's shoreline from the rail, without ever being allowed to cross it. What makes Spithead remarkable, and what earned it a genuinely more sympathetic hearing from the government than what followed at the Nore, is the discipline the mutineers maintained throughout. When word reached the fleet that a French squadron might be putting to sea, the same mutinying sailors who had refused to obey their officers on every other matter immediately manned their guns and prepared the fleet for battle, making unmistakably clear that this was a protest over conditions and pay, not disloyalty to king or country, and that they remained entirely willing to fight and die for England the moment an actual enemy appeared, even while withholding their labour from every other duty until their grievances were addressed. Admiral Lord Howe, dispatched to negotiate directly with the delegates, found men who were angry, organised, and entirely reasonable in their demands, articulate about exactly what they wanted and why, in a manner that impressed even officers who had entered the negotiations expecting to find something closer to mob violence. The government, genuinely alarmed at the prospect of a mutinous Channel fleet standing between Britain and a French invasion force at the height of a desperate war, agreed to nearly all of the Spithead delegates' demands within weeks: a royal pardon for every man involved, a pay raise, the first in a century and a half, improvements to provisioning meant to curb the worst of the purser's pound abuses, and better arrangements for the sick and wounded. The Spithead mutiny ended in late April with cheering crews, a formal pardon read aloud from ship to ship, and a fleet that put back to sea having won, through organised and disciplined collective action, several of the exact protections a pirate crew's articles had guaranteed by simple vote 75 years earlier. Among the Spithead delegates, one name recurs across multiple surviving accounts of the negotiations with particular prominence: Valentine Joyce, a quartermaster's mate aboard Hunt's Royal George, who emerged as one of the mutiny's most capable and level-headed organisers, credited by contemporary observers with helping keep the protest disciplined and focused on its stated grievances, even as tempers among thousands of frustrated sailors occasionally threatened to boil over into something less controlled. It is a small, striking detail, easy to miss and worth pausing on deliberately, the very job title Joyce held aboard his own ship: quartermaster's mate, an assistant to the officer responsible for stores and provisions, carried, by pure institutional coincidence, an echo of the exact office this story spent an entire chapter examining aboard pirate vessels 3/4 of a century earlier. An elected or semi-elected position historically associated, in its piratical form, with representing the interests of the common crew against concentrated authority above them. Joyce, by all surviving accounts, brought exactly that same instinct to his role among the Spithead delegates, negotiating firmly but without needless provocation, understanding intuitively what a good pirate quartermaster had understood 100 years before him, that a crew's leverage came from unity and discipline, not chaos, and that the moment a protest turned into simple lawlessness, it lost the very legitimacy that made it dangerous to ignore. The Nore Mutiny, which began barely a month later in May of 1797, among ships anchored at the Nore rather than at Spithead, followed a similar structure of elected delegates and formal grievances, but it unfolded very differently, and Richard Parker's role in it is where this story's arc turns from cautious triumph toward tragedy. Parker, an experienced sailor who had briefly held an officer's warrant earlier in his career, before financial troubles and a court-martial reduced him back to the ranks, was elected president of the Nor delegates. And under his leadership, the mutiny's demands grew considerably more ambitious than Spithead's had been. Not only pay and provisions, but a greater say in the appointment and removal of officers, more generous distribution of prize money, and, most alarmingly to the government, the power to approve or block the fleet's own movements, effectively giving the mutineers a veto over naval operations rather than simply better terms of service within the existing chain of command. It's a demand that, read against everything this story has already covered, sounds almost like an attempt to import the pirate ship's own system of elected checks and shared authority directly into the Royal Navy's formal structure. The crew voting not just on grievances, but on strategy and command itself, the same authority a pirate quartermaster's office had quietly claimed for itself 3/4 of a century before, minus the noose waiting at the end of it for the men who tried. The government, having already made significant concessions at Spithead just weeks earlier, was in no mood to grant anything resembling that at the Nor, and the more radical demands, combined with a decision by the Nor mutineers to blockade the mouth of the Thames itself, cutting off London's maritime trade in an effort to force the government's hand, cost the movement the broad public and political sympathy Spithead had managed to hold on to throughout its own protest. Where Spithead had kept its guns manned and ready the moment an external threat appeared, the Nor mutineers' blockade read. To a government and a public already anxious about revolutionary sentiment spreading from France, as something closer to open rebellion against the state itself rather than a labour dispute over pay and food. Support for the mutiny began to fracture within weeks as individual ships, one by one, judged the cause increasingly hopeless, and the risk of eventual punishment increasingly certain, slipping their cables and sailing back under the King's authority rather than continuing to stand with Parker and the remaining delegates. By mid-June, the mutiny had collapsed entirely, and the manner of its unravelling deserves a moment's attention, because it happened not through a single decisive government victory, but through a slow, grinding attrition of will among the mutineers themselves. Ship after ship, weighing the increasingly remote odds of the government ever agreeing to terms as sweeping as the ones the Nora delegates had demanded against the increasingly certain prospect of eventual punishment for continued defiance, quietly cut their cables and slipped away from the main body of the mutiny to rejoin the fleet under the King's authority, each departure making the position of those who remained a little more isolated and a little more exposed. Parker, watching his own coalition dissolve ship by ship over the course of barely 2 weeks, is described in surviving accounts as having understood well before the end that the cause was lost, and yet he stayed at his post as president of the delegates rather than attempting to flee or disappear into the general confusion, a decision that likely sealed his own fate but that also, in the eyes of at least some contemporary observers, spoke to a genuine sense of obligation toward the men who had elected him, even as that obligation cost him everything. Parker, along with dozens of other identified ringleaders, was arrested and brought before a formal court-martial, the same rigid officer-only system of naval justice this story has already examined closely, offering no elected peer jury, no sympathetic shipmates, permitted to argue for leniency the way 2 of Harry Glasby's fellow pirates had once argued, successfully, for his life. Parker was convicted and sentenced to death, and the Admiralty, keen to make an unmistakable example of the mutiny's collapse to the rest of the fleet, carried out the execution swiftly and publicly aboard the very ship where the mutiny had first taken hold. Somewhere in the range of 29 men were ultimately hanged in the aftermath of the Nor mutiny, with dozens more flogged, imprisoned or transported, a grim and thorough demonstration that whatever ground the Crown had been willing to concede at Spithead, it had no intention of conceding at the Nor, where the demands had reached too far into the Navy's own chain of command for any government to accept while still at war. There is something genuinely difficult to sit with in the parallel this story has been building toward all night, and it's worth stating plainly rather than dressing it up. The compensation clauses, the elected representation, the checks on arbitrary command that Roberts's crew and dozens of other pirate crews had simply voted into their own articles decades earlier. Without asking permission from anyone, without needing a mutiny or a blockade or a formal negotiation with an admiral, those same basic protections had to be fought for, at the Nore and at Spithead both, by honest sailors risking, and in Parker's case losing, their lives against the very government those pirate crews had spent their careers stealing from. A ship's company of criminals built a fairer system by simple, immediate consensus in an afternoon, decades before any of this began, on ships with no legal standing whatsoever, governed by men the world had already sentenced to hang on sight. It took the sailors of the legitimate Royal Navy an organised, fleet-wide, multi-week mutiny, and, for some of them, the gallows, to win even a portion of the same ground, from a government with every legal and institutional advantage a pirate crew never had, and every reason, on paper, to have built something fairer first. The aftermath, in fairness to the system that eventually did respond, wasn't nothing, and it's worth giving the reforms their genuine due rather than ending this chapter purely on the note of Parker's execution. The pay raise won at Spithead held, the first genuine increase to Navy wages in a century and a half, and it did not need to be won twice. Subsequent adjustments, though still slow by any modern standard, came somewhat more readily in the decades that followed, as the Admiralty absorbed the lesson that a fleet pushed too far past the edge of tolerable hardship could simply stop obeying orders, war or no war. Provisioning reforms aimed at curbing the worst abuses of the purser's short pound continued, gradually in the years that followed, alongside slow, incremental improvements to how sick and wounded sailors were processed and cared for, improvements that built, across the following decades, into something considerably better than what Davy Cobb or the wounded topman aboard the Centurion had faced earlier in this story. Naval historians looking back on the period generally treat 1797 as a genuine hinge point, the moment the Admiralty could no longer simply assume its sailors' patience was infinite, and the reforms that followed, however grudging and incremental, trace a reasonably direct line toward the more professionalised, better administered Navy of the following century. None of it arrived quickly. None of it arrived as a single sweeping act of reform. It arrived the way most reform to entrenched institutions tends to arrive, unevenly, grudgingly, under duress, and only after the human cost of not reforming had become too visible, too organised, and too dangerous to the state's own stability to ignore any longer. Richard Parker's grave, following his execution, was initially denied any formal burial by naval authorities determined to make even his death a warning rather than a memorial. His body was quietly taken by his widow, who travelled to the Nore herself to claim it after formal channels refused her, and given a proper burial only after she personally petitioned for the right to do so, a small human coda to a much larger story about what a government will and won't concede to men who ask for fairness through the wrong channel, at the wrong moment, in a war it cannot afford to lose. It is one more echo, however faint, of another burial this story began with. A pirate captain's body, wrapped in his own ship's colours and given to the sea by his own crew's hands, denied to his enemies exactly as he'd asked, on a morning 75 years before Parker ever stood on the Sandwich's deck. Two men, worlds apart in the law's eyes, one an outlaw who took hundreds of ships and answered to no crown at all, the other a loyal sailor who wanted nothing more than fair pay and decent food from the very government he'd sworn to serve, both denied. In their different ways, the simple dignity of being laid to rest by the same authority that had killed them, and both, in their own fashion, part of the same long uneven story about what it actually took, across most of a century, to make the ocean a slightly fairer place to work. Think back, for a moment, to where tonight actually started, a barefoot sailor watching pieces of 8 counted out fairly under a tropical sun, and a world away, another sailor chewing on a 14-ounce pound of biscuit that was already crawling with weevils before he'd even earned the wage that was supposed to pay for it. That gap between what a ship's company of outlaws built for itself out of nothing but self-interest and shared risk, and what a crown with every legal advantage in the world managed to offer its own loyal sailors for 144 years running, is the whole story, and you've carried it all the way through with you tonight. Cuffy's burned hand, paid for within the week, Davy Cobb's shattered leg, filed away in an office in Chatham to wait its turn, Robert Tunstall's carpenter's hands, and Harry Glasby's life, spared by a vote instead of a rope. Richard Parker, 75 years later, finally winning some small piece of the same fairness for the Crown's own sailors, and paying for it with his life. The same ocean that gave Bartholomew Roberts a burial his enemies couldn't touch, denying Parker's own body a resting place, until his widow demanded it back. None of this makes piracy something to romanticise, and none of it was meant to. Men died under those black flags, and men died just as surely under the King's white ensign, and the theft and the fear were exactly as real, on both sides, as the fairness sometimes was. But there's something worth sitting with in the dark tonight all the same. The idea that fairness doesn't have to wait for permission. It doesn't have to come from a crown, or a parliament, or an admiral's mercy. Sometimes it gets built, out of pure necessity, by whoever's left holding the rope, and it holds for as long as everyone involved keeps choosing, quietly, to honour it. You're warm right now. You're safe. Nobody's weighing out your dinner to the ounce, and nobody's going to make you wait 3 years to be paid for the day you just lived. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually, when you stop to think about how many people, across how many centuries, never had it. So let the weight of tonight settle now. Let Cuffy's chickens and Davy's hammock and Tunstall's careful hands fade into the quiet the way all these stories eventually do. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.